In the early hours of January 27, 2017, a security camera inside Hong Kong's Four Seasons captures its last clean, uncomplicated image of a man who believed borders could still protect him. Xiao Jianhua pushed through the lobby in a wheelchair, his head covered, moving fast. No badges, no paperwork offered to the public, just the blunt logistics of removal. Xiao wasn't a protester or a dissident. He was a billionaire, ranked on the 2016 Hurun China Rich List with an estimated net worth of $5.97 billion, and the architect of a financial web that touched banks, insurers, and the private conduits of Beijing's elite. Then the cameras go dark in the way modern states prefer, not with shattered lenses, but with information attrition. Reuters reported that searches on Chinese platforms stopped returning recent coverage, leaving mostly older fragments. On WeChat, more than 40 articles containing his name were censored within days. Hong Kong police later said CCTV at the hotel and a border checkpoint indicated he crossed into the mainland and voluntarily left, an official conclusion that sits uneasily beside the core fact: a man disappears and the record follows him into silence. This story matters because it exposes a hard rule of sovereignty. When a one-party state decides capital is dangerous, wealth stops being armor and starts being a handle. The late 1970s in China do not arrive like a sunrise. They arrive like a bruise, dark, tender, slow to fade. The land still carries the memory of famine in its ribs, empty granaries, thin harvests, the taste of husks and grit. In the north, winter air bites hard enough to sting the lungs. Coal smoke knots itself into the low sky and settles on brick, on laundry lines, on the edges of frost. The country is vast, and it is tired. Political purges have left whole offices hollowed out, cadres reassigned, reputations calcified into silence. The state remains, heavy as a concrete dam, but the water behind it has been rising. Anger, hunger, ambition, dread. Beyond the borders, the world is not waiting. Rival powers watch, measure, and posture. Beijing, bruised by stagnation and the humiliations that come with it, has a clock on the table. Not a clock you can see, a clock you can feel in the attrition of credibility. How long a government can ask for obedience while offering only austerity. How long it can hold sovereignty with slogans when the markets outside are sharpening into hegemony. Historians debate the precise balance of fear and calculation in those years, but the pressure is visible in the decisions that follow. A gamble on living standards as a shield, a bet that bread and wages can buy time. Time against rivals, time against domestic anger, time against the slow desolation of being left behind. So the coastal rim becomes a crack in the wall, not a collapse, a controlled fracture. Special economic zones, names that will later sound inevitable, are carved into the map like incisions. Shenzhen, a place that had been more boundary than city, sits close to Hong Kong like a lit fuse placed near a store of dry wood. The sea air there smells of salt and diesel, and the ground is wet with monsoon runoff that turns soil into a quagmire. What happens next is not poetic, it is administrative. Stamps, forms, permits, a new kind of permission. The stakes are not abstract. If the gamble works, legitimacy hardens. If it fails, the state risks something worse than poverty. The public certainty that the system cannot feed, cannot protect, cannot deliver. And in a country with recent famine memory, that certainty is a solvent. We move inward, away from slogans and toward the streets where policy becomes weather. A northern city in winter, bicycles crowd the avenues in dense, rattling rivers of steel. Their chains click and clatter, breath fogs from mouths in quick bursts. Wool collars are damp at the edges where snow has melted into grime. Coal smoke hangs in the air with a bitter tang, sulphur and ash, and it works its way into bread, into bedding, into the hairline cracks of apartment stairwells. In factory canteens, metal trays scrape against tables. The steam from thin soup smells faintly of cabbage and boiled starch. In cramped dormitories, bodies sleep stacked and close, the wood of bunk frames creaking under every shift. The walls are thin enough to pass coughs and footsteps like signals. And now, amid this familiar scarcity, something new is introduced: risk. The mechanism is a dual-track system. Two rails laid side by side, each with its own rules, neither fully replacing the other. State quotas remain. Factories still owe the plan its output. Farms still answer to production targets. But surplus, what exceeds the quota, can be sold for cash. That single hinge changes how hands move. The quota is not a metaphor, it is a ledger. Grain, textiles, steel, numbers entered, checked, signed, stamped. The first portion goes where the plan says it must go, at set prices. Only after that obligation is met does a second market exist, where the surplus can be traded for money that feels warmer in the pocket than ration coupons ever did. The proof of compliance is paper, forms smudged with ink, corners curled from handling, a red approval stamp that decides whether the surplus is legitimate or contraband. On the coastal edge, this new permission draws labour like gravity. Interior provinces, already strained, begin to bleed people toward ports and construction sites, not in a clean stream, but in constant seepage. Attrition shows up in villages as empty benches at meetings, a shortage of young backs for the hardest work, swollen feet returning home only for brief intervals, then leaving again. The road becomes a corridor of movement. Bundles tied in cloth, battered suitcases, hands rough with callous, gripping railings in crowded carriages. Train compartments smell of sweat, damp wool, tobacco, and the metallic bite of cheap thermoses. In Shenzhen and the other coastal zones, the change is visible in the most material ways. Earth is dug up, concrete is poured, rebar rises like ribs out of mud. Trucks grind past, their engines coughing black fumes. Temporary barracks and dormitories grow around factories, and canteens serve food fast enough to keep workers on their feet. Inside workshops, fluorescent lights hum, machine belts whir, grease stains spread across cotton sleeves. The new skill people learn is not a trade. It is the willingness to step into uncertainty, measured in back wages, in favours whispered through bureaucratic corridors, in the risk that a permit will not come, that a contract will be voided, that a supervisor will be reassigned. Hard choices sharpen in quiet places, stay inland with guaranteed but meagre stability, or go coastal and accept volatility, obey the old channels or test the new ones and risk being crushed if the state decides the fracture has spread too far. Each choice has teeth, and above it all, the political clock keeps ticking. After 1989, growth becomes more than policy. It becomes doctrine, a governing doctrine, a replacement for older forms of legitimacy that have been cracked by violence and doubt. The air in meeting rooms is stale with cigarette smoke and paper. The decisions are written down, filed, enforced. Tightened political control runs alongside unleashed market forces like two currents in the same river, and the turbulence is not an accident. It is managed, it is feared, it is used. A business permit on a desk, cheap paper, slightly fibrous under the fingertips. The corners are soft from handling. A hand hovers above it, ink-stained fingers, nail beds rimmed with grime from work and travel. The stamp comes down with a dull, final thud. Red ink blooms on the page, glossy at first, then slowly drying, macro on ink drying. You can hear it in the room, the faint scrape of a chair leg, the tick of a wall clock, the soft rasp of breathing. You can smell damp wool from a coat hung nearby, and the sour edge of cold tea left too long in a glass. The approval mark is not romance. It is sovereignty rendered into a tool, permission that can be granted, withheld, reversed. In that wet sheen of red, the state's authority and the market's hunger touch and do not reconcile. The fracture is now permanent, markets loosened, politics tightened. The next world will reward proximity to power more than talent, access more than merit, and the ink, still drying, already feels like a trap closing around a new kind of life. The coast accelerates, the interior strains, and Beijing watches the strain like a physician watching a fever, counting the pulse, weighing the risk of collapse against the risk of control slipping. In the 1980s, the reforms do not move in a straight line. They lurch, they advance, they pause, they tighten. They surge again. Policy becomes a living thing, reactive and sharp-edged, shaped by shortages, by factional disputes, by the fear that prosperity can corrode loyalty as quickly as hunger can. Outside the country, rivals gauge the shift, a giant recalibrating, no longer content to endure stagnation. Inside the country, legitimacy is no longer a monument carved in stone. It is a calculation renewed every month. Wages paid, shelves stocked, anger contained. And then comes the moment when the clock becomes audible. 1989 does not simply happen as an event. It becomes a dividing line after which growth is treated as insulation, against dissent, against humiliation, against the old spectre of political fracture. Contemporary sources and later analyses converge on the central consequence. The state's priority hardens. Stability first. Expansion as a governing doctrine. Control tightened with one hand while markets are allowed to pull with the other. The contradiction is not an accident. It is the system. The stakes rise accordingly. A generation is being trained to move, across provinces, across occupations, across rules that are still half-written. If the machine feeds them, it survives. If it fails, it invites something Beijing cannot allow, the public conviction that sovereignty has become performance. We move down from the capital's calculations into the places where reform becomes friction. A factory gate at dawn. Frost still clings to the metal bars. A line of workers forms in the half-light, shoulders hunched, breath white and fast. The air smells of coal smoke and wet concrete. Somewhere a radio crackles through static. Bicycles lean in tight rows, their seats slick with cold. On the wall, slogans fade under soot, the paint flaking like dry skin. Inside, the dual-track system produces a new geography of power. The plan still demands its quotas, but now there is also surplus cash and the temptation to reroute it. The state's old arteries, the ministries, the local bureaus, the ration channels, remain in place, but a second circulatory system grows alongside them. Informal introductions, stamped approvals, whispered favours traded for access to raw materials and transport. A factory receives inputs, steel, coal, cotton, often allocated through state channels. The output is split, the quota portion delivered at fixed prices to fulfil obligations, the surplus portion sold at higher market prices, sometimes through newly tolerated markets, sometimes through intermediaries who know which office to visit and which form to file. The choke points are physical: rail cars, truck permits, warehouse locks, procurement stamps. Whoever controls transport and paper controls profit. A missing stamp can leave a shipment rotting on a platform. A delayed rail allocation can stall an entire production line. Corruption is not a rumour in this environment. It is a method of lubrication, and it comes with a cost paid in resentment and in risk. The cost is visible in attrition. In dormitories, coughs spread in the stale air. Damp bedding never fully dries. Cheap soap leaves hands cracked and raw. In canteens, food is swallowed fast, tin bowls clanging, steam smelling of oil and starch. Wages do not always arrive on time. Back pay becomes a quiet terror. Months of labour condensed into an envelope that might never come, depending on a manager's connections or a bureau's mood. People learn to keep receipts, to keep copies, to keep favours in reserve like hidden coins sewn into a jacket seam. Outside the zones, the interior provinces feel the drain. A village road in late autumn, ruts filled with cold water, the smell of mud and smoke from crop stubble burning. Fewer young men, fewer young women. A rusted scythe hangs unused in a shed. Grain stores are thinner. The work falls heavier on the remaining shoulders. The migration is not only economic, it is demographic, social, political. The state must now manage movement on a scale that strains its old mechanisms of registration and rationing, even as it needs that movement to keep the coastal machine fed. The friction reaches into the street. Markets expand, prices loosen, and with loosening comes volatility, an unevenness that can taste like freedom to one person and like theft to another. A shop window in a coastal city. Imported goods behind glass, bright packaging, unfamiliar logos. Outside, the pavement is slick with rain. The air smells of frying oil and diesel exhaust. A man in a worn jacket watches the display, hands rough and chapped, then turns away toward a dim alley where cheap noodles are sold. The gap between what can be seen and what can be afforded grows sharper, more visible, harder to ignore. And after 1989, the political perimeter tightens. The message is not delivered as poetry. It is delivered as procedure, surveillance, discipline, restrictions, appointments. Local officials learn the new rule: deliver growth, prevent disorder. The incentives calcify. Promotions begin to depend on numbers, construction, output, revenue, measured in reports and graphs, backed by stamps and signatures. Distance from the capital becomes a weight. Proximity becomes a kind of currency. The effects are plain. A system forms where talent can be outmatched by access, and where access often depends on who can reach the right desk, the right bureau, the right stamp. A payroll office at the end of a long week. The room is cramped. Fluorescent lights buzz. The air is stale with cigarette smoke and damp wool. A ledger lies open, pages warped slightly from humidity. A hand flips through it, thumb blackened at the nail from machine grease that never washes out. Names, numbers, columns. A red stamp hits a line, approved. Another line left blank, not approved. A worker's pay becomes a mark on paper, a decision made by someone behind a desk, someone whose authority is as heavy as the stamp itself. On the table, the ink glistens again, wet, bright, drying slow. It smells faintly chemical, sharp in the nose. The worker's fingers hover near the page but do not touch it. Not yet. The rules are changing, but the power to permit and to deny remains concentrated, tightened, indomitable. And the question that rises with the smell of ink and smoke is not whether China will grow. It is who will be allowed to breathe inside that growth, and who will be crushed beneath it. By the 1990s, the fracture has hardened into architecture. Along the coast, cranes stand like metal scaffolds against the haze. Containers stack at ports in disciplined rows, their paint scuffed, their corners dented from impact. On winter mornings, the air tastes of soot and salt. On summer nights, it smells of algae, diesel, and wet concrete cooling after heat. The world's supply chains begin to feel China's weight, not as rumour, not as prediction, but as shipments, contracts, and deadlines. Hegemony is no longer only geopolitical posture, it is economic gravity. Inside the country, the interior continues to thin, not in a single dramatic wave, but in relentless attrition. Villages lose the young, county seats swell, factory towns become magnets. The old socialist promise of equal allocation does not vanish, but it is now layered beneath a new reality of uneven access. The state, having wagered legitimacy on rising living standards, becomes bound to growth like a man bound to a cart. If it stops moving, it risks being trampled by what it has pulled behind it: expectations. After 1989, the governing doctrine of growth does not arrive with speeches alone. It arrives with enforcement. It arrives with promotions, punishments, and the cold logic of stability maintenance. The political centre tightens its grip even as it tolerates and channels market energy. Sovereignty is protected not by relaxing control but by refining it. The stakes, once framed as survival against stagnation, become something more corrosive: survival against success. A system that feeds itself must keep feeding. A system that measures legitimacy and prosperity must keep producing prosperity. The ticking clock does not stop. It simply changes its rhythm. We move to the city, where the consequences are loud enough to hear and sharp enough to touch. A construction corridor in a coastal zone. Jackhammers rattle through the morning. Dust hangs in the sunlight like ground bone. Workers in cheap gloves haul rebar, hands blistered, palms calloused, wrists wrapped in cloth. Their boots are caked with cement. Their jackets smell of sweat and damp cotton. At lunch, they crouch by a curb with metal tins, rice and vegetables gone lukewarm, eating fast because time is paid in piecework and supervisors watch the clock. Nearby, a billboard rises above the noise, bright and clean, promising comfort. Below it, the street is slick with spilled oil and rainwater. The dual-track era matures into a broader market landscape, but it never becomes a pure market. It becomes a market threaded through administration. Permissions remain, approvals remain, the stamp remains. Local officials are evaluated through performance indicators: production increases, revenue, infrastructure completion, social stability. These are not abstract. They are compiled in reports, checked against targets, signed by superiors. The system rewards deliverables that can be counted. Roads poured, factories opened, output increased. What cannot be easily counted, fatigue, resentment, long-term environmental damage, tends to be deferred. The incentive structure calcifies into a hierarchy of metrics, and those metrics drive decisions down to the level of land use, relocation, and industrial priorities. That is where the human cost thickens. In old neighbourhoods, Demolition notices appear on damp walls, paper curling at the edges in humid air. Families pack belongings into woven sacks. Stairwells smell of mould and cooking oil. The wood of door frames splinters where furniture scrapes past. Somewhere in the north, coal continues to burn, thickening the air into a perpetual overcast. Bread carries ash in its crust. Laundry hung outside comes back with a faint grey film. Rivers take on industrial colours, and the wind carries chemical notes that sting the throat. The new prosperity is real, but it is not clean. It is not evenly distributed. It is not gentle. And yet, for many, the immediate fallout is also unmistakable. Cash wages where there were coupons, consumer goods where there were bare shelves, mobility where there were fixed assignments. Markets fill with noise, vendors shouting prices, plastic bags snapping in the wind, scales clinking, coins dropped into metal trays. In city streets, bicycles still crowd the avenues, but now they weave around trucks and buses that cough exhaust and shake the pavement. The soundscape thickens, horns, engines, construction, the constant grind of movement. The political perimeter remains firm. Control is not loosened to match the market's looseness. It is refined to manage it. The state tolerates volatility in commerce because it fears volatility in governance. Stability is guarded with bureaucracy and force. The costs are borne in private lives, in self-censorship, in the silent understanding that opportunity has boundaries. A system forms where proximity to power often outweighs talent, where networks can outrun merit, where approvals become bottlenecks and bottlenecks become markets. The interior to coast migration entrenches new hierarchies of status and access. The coastal rim becomes a front line of opportunity. The capital becomes a gravitational centre of permission. We return to the permit, the stamp, the ink. A small office again, the kind with a battered desk and a metal filing cabinet that squeals when opened. The air is warm from a radiator that clanks and hisses. It smells of dust, ink and cheap paper. A stack of forms sits under a paperweight, corners stained, edges frayed. A clerk's fingers are ink-marked, nails trimmed short. He presses the stamp down, hard. The sound is blunt, final. Red spreads, glossy, then begins to dry. Macron ink drying. In that drying ink is the compromise that defines the era. Markets permitted, politics tightened, wealth rising, control deepening, mobility expanding, hierarchy hardening. The person who receives the paper may never see the larger architecture. They will see only what the paper allows: a job, a dorm bed, a wage, a route to the coast, a doorway into the new economy, or a denial that sends them back into the cold with nothing but time lost. The red mark dries. It seals an outcome. It also leaves a residue, because every approval implies a gatekeeper, and every gatekeeper implies a hierarchy that can be sold, defended, hoarded. What China builds in these years is not only factories and roads, it builds a logic, legitimacy through growth, sovereignty through control, advancement through access. And as that logic spreads, it sets the conditions for what comes next, where the distance to the capital is not measured in kilometres, but in the number of doors that will open before the ink dries. The stamp lifts, the page remains, and somewhere beyond the frame, another desk waits. Beijing in the 1990s is not a skyline yet. It is a pressure system. Winter clamps down hard. The wind comes off the north like a file across bare skin, dragging grit through the avenues. Coal smoke still sinks into the city's throat, and the light has a sickly colour in late afternoon. Sun filtered through particulate haze, turning distant buildings into smudged silhouettes. This is the capital of a country that has tied legitimacy to growth and growth to control. After 1989, the doctrine is no longer debated in public. It is administered. From the outside, the transformation looks like momentum. Factories, exports, contracts. From inside Beijing, it looks like something else entirely. An apparatus managing velocity. The capital is where policy is written, revised, reissued, often by circular, not precedent, because precedent implies a rule that can bind the hand of power. Here, sovereignty is guarded by keeping the rules movable. When the rules can shift overnight, the safest compass is not law, it is proximity. This is how a bazaar forms without stalls, not a bazaar of fruit and cloth, but of permissions, licenses, approvals, loan quotas, regulatory carve-outs. The city rewards those who can get close enough to hear the change before it arrives in print, close enough to be warned, invited, protected. The cost of distance is not measured in kilometres. It is measured in missed windows, frozen deals, delayed signatures. Attrition is bureaucratic. A project dies not with a gunshot, but with a stamp withheld until the season has passed. The stakes are brutal in their simplicity. In a system where regulation is a moving wall, capital becomes cautious, and cautious capital becomes prey. If you stay small, you may survive, but you will be limited, fenced in by rules you cannot influence. If you grow, you must grow through the channels that exist, and those channels are human. Gatekeepers who can turn a whispered introduction into a license or a loan. That choice, small and safe, or big and entangled, hangs over the decade like frost on a wire. We descend into the city's daily machinery, where commerce is not abstract. It is paper and breath. A bank corridor, fluorescent lit, smells of floor polish and stale tobacco. Leather shoes squeak on tile. A clerk carries a stack of stamped ledgers, thick, worn, edges darkened by sweat and handling. The ink on the stamps is the same harsh red, sometimes glossy, sometimes already dried into a matte crust. In a side office, a metal seal is pressed into wax. In another, an envelope is slid across a desk and disappears into a drawer that locks with a dull click. Outside, traffic grinds through slush. Buses cough exhaust. Street vendors sell steaming buns from metal carts, the air around them rich with yeast and oil, while wind knifes through gaps in coats. People move fast, heads down, shoulders tight against the cold. Behind them, in hotels and meeting rooms, a different kind of movement happens. Slow, deliberate, calibrated. A round table under bright lights. Dishes arrive in cycles. Hot broth, braised meat, fish slick with sauce. The room smells of alcohol and cigarette smoke layered over food, sweet, sharp, greasy. Laughter rises and falls, not as spontaneity but as rhythm. Hands reach for glasses, a tie is loosened, a sleeve brushes a wristwatch. A phone vibrates once, then goes still. No dialogue is needed to understand the mechanism. The table is not only eating, it is aligning. Mechanism. Moment. In Beijing's policy economy, the key commodity is not merely money, it is permission. A license can determine whether an insurer exists, whether a bank can expand, whether an acquisition can be recognized. Loans are not only priced by interest, they're constrained by quotas, by regulatory attitudes, by political appetite. When circulars can revise what is allowed, relationships become an enforcement layer. Who will vouch, who will interpret, who will call the right bureau and ensure a file is not buried. This is the ecosystem in which Tomorrow Group takes shape, described as a holding web, not a single clean corporation. Stakes are bought in banks and insurers. Deals are financed through layered entities that can obscure exposure, distribute risk, and, just as importantly, present different faces to different regulators. A holding structure can be a maze of subsidiaries, affiliates, investment vehicles, each with its own paperwork, its own board stamps, its own compliant posture on a given day. The physical reality of that web is not a metaphor. It is folders, it is share certificates, it is registration documents, it is signatures in ink. Daily commerce is enforced as much by relationships as by courts, because courts require stable rules, and stable rules require limits on discretionary power. In this environment, enforcement often arrives as phone calls, as introductions, as the sudden closing of a door, or the sudden opening of one. A contract may be written on clean paper, but its strength can depend on who witnessed the signing, who can make trouble, who can block the flow of money if the other side defects. And then there is the hard choice, repeated in 1,000 boardrooms and backrooms: stay small and safe, or tie your fortune to factions you do not control, because in Beijing, growth without protection can become a liability. A large balance sheet attracts attention. Attention attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny attracts politics. Attrition shows itself in quieter consequences: executives who disappear from public view, deals that evaporate after a new circular, projects abandoned midstream, workers sent home when financing stalls. The system is indomitable, but it is not gentle. It can turn a thriving enterprise into a husk with a single administrative turn. We cut tight to the object that survives every banquet and every circular, a worn folder of share certificates. The cardboard is softened at the corners, the surface scuffed where hands have gripped it too many times. A seal of fresh red ink closes it, thick, still wet enough to glint under the desk lamp. The lamp itself smokes faintly, a hot metal smell, and the paper inside carries a dry, dusty scent, like old books and glue. A thumb presses lightly near the seal, not breaking it, testing its tack. Ink clings, then releases. The folder is heavy with more than paper. It is heavy with leverage, ownership that can unlock loans, influence that can reroute approvals, stakes that can be offered as collateral in a deal shaped by relationships rather than statutes. Historical ambiguity. The exact level of Xiao Jianhua's access to top-party families remains disputed due to secrecy, intermediaries, and retrospective political bias. Responsible reading cites strong evidence of elite links but uncertain pathways. The seal dries. The folder goes into a briefcase. The latch snaps shut with a sound like a small verdict. And somewhere in the capital's cold air, another circular is being drafted. Another shift in the rules that will reward the close and punish the distant. Beijing tightens as it grows. The capital is no longer just a seat of government. It becomes the valve that controls a national surge of money, licenses, and institutional power. The 1990s bring speed, but also strain. State banks pushed to fund expansion, insurers and lenders pulled into new roles, and regulators forced to improvise in real time. The air tastes metallic on bad mornings, wind carrying coal grit that scrapes the throat. Policy arrives not as a stable code but as waves of circulars, each one a small earthquake that shifts who is allowed to profit and who is left in bureaucratic desolation. In this environment, sovereignty is defended through discretion, and discretion creates a market of proximity. The ticking clock is seasonal and political. Quarter ends, year-end audits, personnel reshuffles. A signature that lands before a circular changes can mean survival. The same signature 1 week later can mean rejection. The rules are movable, and so the players move, fast, cautious, hungry. We cut to a ministry corridor, long, fluorescent lit, smelling of damp wool and cigarette ash, ground into the corners of a stairwell. A row of men in dark suits sit on metal chairs, briefcases between their ankles, knuckles pale from gripping worn handles. A radiator hisses. A wall clock clicks forward with the indifference of a machine. Files pass from hand to hand. Folders thick with share certificates, stamped forms, photocopies curled from heat and humidity. The paper is cheap, but the consequences are indomitable. This is where patronage becomes tangible. Not as a rumour, but as scheduling, as access to the right office, as the ability to make a document visible. The capital rewards those who can shorten the distance between a request and a seal. Tomorrow Group grows inside this logic, building a holding web, buying stakes in banks and insurers, financing deals through layered entities. The structure is not elegance, it is camouflage and leverage, designed to survive shifting rules and to keep options open when a regulator's mood hardens overnight. Mechanism, moment, how a layered holding web turns influence into credit. A stake in a financial institution can be used as collateral, pledged, repledged, and nested inside affiliated entities so that exposure is distributed across paperwork. One entity holds shares, another borrows against them, another routes funds into a purchase. Each step generates its own contracts, seals, and filings. The system's weak point is not the math, it is the choke points, registration approvals, license renewals, bank committees, the clerk who decides whether your file sits on top of the stack or under it. The sound of the mechanism is simple. Stamp, 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 red ink drying while money changes direction. Then comes friction. Rival interests contest deals. Regulators probe structures they cannot fully map. A bank may slow walk a loan, citing procedural review, while the real cause is political weather. A license application returns with a missing seal, a new requirement, a correction demanded in triplicate. The cost is attrition. Weeks wasted, capital trapped, projects stalled, workers sent back to dorms with pay delayed. In factory canteens far from the capital, metal chopsticks clink against tin bowls. Outside, trucks idle in sleet, engines coughing, shipments late because a paper barrier held them hostage. A private dining room behind heavy doors. Carpet muffles footsteps. The table is round and crowded with plates. Meat glazed dark, fish laid whole, soup steaming and rich with oil. The air is thick with tobacco and baijiu, sharp enough to sting the eyes. Laughter rises, then falls into a low murmur as someone checks a pager, as someone leans in to listen. No dialogue is shown because the proof is not in words. It is in the choreography of access. Who is seated closest to whom? Who pause? Who waits? Who is introduced? The hard choice sharpens here. Stay small and safe, or grow by tying your fortune to factions you do not control. Staying small means surviving on the edges, less scrutiny, fewer doors, fewer opportunities. Growing means entanglement, loans, licenses, stakes, and the silent dependence on gatekeepers whose loyalties can be bought, broken, or reassigned. In Beijing, power does not always announce itself, it circulates. It can be present through intermediaries, through family networks, through institutional alliances that never appear on letterhead. Historical ambiguity. The exact pathways of Xiao Jianhua's access to top party families remain contested due to secrecy, intermediaries, and retrospective political bias, despite strong evidence of elite links. When policy shifts, the banquet table can turn from shelter to exposure. A circular lands, a bureau reinterprets a rule, a patron loses position, and suddenly, a once smooth channel becomes a quagmire of new signatures, new inspections, new denials. We cut to the aftermath of a single decision. A desk lamp throws yellow light onto a contract. The paper is thin, almost translucent at the edges. A thumbprint smudge darkens one corner where someone handled it with sweat-wet hands. Beside it lies a worn folder of share certificates. The cardboard softened like old leather. Fresh red ink seals it shut, still glossy, still tacky. The room smells of paper dust, ink solvent, and cold tea gone bitter in a glass. A hand presses the seal, testing whether it is set, then releases. The ink clings for a moment and lets go. This is the moment where influence becomes leverage, and leverage becomes obligation. One stamp can open a loan. One loan can force a new stake. One stake can require another introduction. The chain grows heavier as it grows longer, and every link is a human gate you cannot fully predict. If the gate closes, who pays the price? The borrower, the employees, the partners, the city blocks that go dark when financing freezes, the seal dries, the folder disappears into a briefcase. And the question that hangs in the stale air is not whether the web can expand, but what happens when the political current reverses and the same proximity that built the fortune becomes the reason it is pulled apart. By the late 1990s, the capital's bazaar of permission has stopped feeling improvised and started feeling structural. Beijing sits under a lid of winter haze, coal smoke pressed low, sunlight dulled into a pale disk, and beneath it, the country's new doctrine hardens, growth as legitimacy, control as insurance. The state can tolerate volatility in commerce, but not volatility in rule. So the rules remain movable, issued by circular, revised by circular, enforced by people who can never be fully replaced by paper. From a distance, this looks like confidence, ports loading, GDP rising, a nation stepping into economic hegemony. Up close, it is a machine that must be fed constantly, because the moment it slows, the questions return, about sovereignty, about competence, about what 1989 did to the old claims of moral authority. The clock is not only political, it is financial. Quarter ends, loan rollovers, year-end audits. A few days of delay can turn liquidity into a quagmire. And Beijing's central reward, the privilege of proximity, becomes the country's central risk. When closeness is the safest currency, the system trains everyone to pursue closeness, to treat access as collateral, to treat relationships as enforcement. We move into the mechanics of the capital's daily work. A regulatory office in midwinter, radiators clank, fluorescent lights buzz. The air smells of damp wool and burned dust from old heaters. Stacks of files sit on metal shelves, folders softened at the edges, paper warped by humidity, stamps layered over stamps until the red looks bruised. In a corridor, shoes scuff linoleum. A clerk's stamp hits a page with a flat, violent sound. Somewhere behind a closed door, an inspection schedule is rewritten and reissued, and an entire week of appointments rearranges itself. This is the aftermath that matters, not a single collapse, but a tightening of the perimeter around who may expand and how. Tomorrow Group's holding web, banks, insurers, layered entities, fits the era precisely because it is built to survive shifting rules. One entity can retreat while another advances. One stake can be pledged while another is quietly accumulated. The structure is not elegant. It is functional under discretion. Mechanism. Moment. How enforcement works when courts are not the main spine. Contracts exist, but they are not always the final arbiter. The practical enforcement layer often runs through licensing authorities, bank committees, and regulators who can freeze approvals, slow transfers, or request additional documentation until a deal bleeds out. A borrower does not merely fear default, he fears administrative strangulation, an account review that halts payments, a license renewal that goes missing, a compliance inspection that arrives at the worst moment. This is why relationships have weight. They can accelerate a stamp, soften a finding, turn a refusal into a delay, and a delay into approval. Outside, the city keeps moving. Traffic grinds through slush. Street vendors' carts hiss with steam, the smell of yeast buns cutting through exhaust. In hotel lobbies, men in dark suits pass sealed envelopes that are thick enough to hold more than paper. The leather of briefcases creaks as they open and close, and the air tastes faintly of stale tobacco. Deals are made with documents but sustained with alignment. Who introduces, who vouches, who can keep a line of credit from snapping under stress. Historical ambiguity. The disputed point remains the exact level and pathways of Xiao Jianhua's access to top-party families, strong evidence of elite links, uncertain routes through intermediaries and secrecy. As the 1990s turn, the hard choice spreads beyond a few ambitious financiers and becomes a national habit. Stay small and safe, or grow by borrowing the protection of a system you cannot command. The larger you become, the more you must borrow not only money but cover. Attrition is visible in the margins. Projects stall when financing pauses. Workers are sent back to dorms, pay delayed, stomachs filled with thin soup and cold rice. A half-built site sits quiet under sleet. Rebar exposed, cement dust crusted on tarps. Because a loan tranche didn't clear. Because a renewal stamp didn't arrive before the holiday closure. Now the camera finds the seed of the next chapter in a small physical transaction. A bank counter under harsh lights. The glass is smudged with fingerprints. A customer fills out a form with a cheap pen that scratches paper, ink skipping on rough fibres. Behind the counter, a clerk flips through subscription documents, tapping them into neat stacks. Her fingertips are stained faintly red from stamps. And the rubber stamp pad smells sharp, chemical. The money being placed here is short, months, sometimes weeks, because the promise is quick return, steady yield, reassurance against uncertainty. But the assets funded on the other end are long, years, real estate projects, equity stakes, loans to entities nested inside other entities. The mismatch is not philosophical, it is arithmetic, and it is perilous. Mechanism. Moment. Maturity mismatch, made concrete. Short-term funds are gathered, often through products sold at bank counters or through intermediaries, then pushed into longer-term illiquid uses. To keep the promise of liquidity, the short-term money must be renewed again and again, rolled over like a wheel that cannot stop turning. The sound of the system is constant. Printers chattering, stamps thudding, drawers locking. If confidence holds, the wheel keeps turning. If confidence breaks, the wheel grinds and everything attached to it feels the shock. On a desk nearby sits the motif that has governed this chapter. A worn folder of share certificates sealed with fresh red ink. The seal is glossy, still drying, and the cardboard edges are softened like old leather from too many hands. The folder smells of dust and glue. The ink smells of solvent and iron. A thumb presses lightly beside the seal, testing tack, then withdraws. Careful, controlled. The seal holds for now. They came for the licenses, they stayed for the loans, and they learned to live on rollovers, short money funding, long promises, until the nation itself begins to breathe in mismatch maturities. The early 2000s arrive with velocity. China steps into the decade with WTO momentum and a hunger that isn't metaphorical. It is hunger for capital, steel and concrete hunger, payroll hunger, hunger measured in megawatts, container loads, and the raw count of young men who need work before idleness curdles into anger. The coastline is lit by export demand. Factories humming, ports stacking containers in disciplined grids, cranes swinging through salty air that smells of diesel and wet rope. Inland, provincial governments chase industry the way parched ground chases rain. They want smokestacks. They want assembly lines. They want anything that turns rural attrition into wages. On cold mornings, the northern wind comes through the cities with a dry bite, carrying dust that rasps against the teeth. Coal smoke still hangs in low layers, and the sky can look bruised even at noon. Yet beneath that haze, money moves faster than the formal system can tolerate. Formal banking remains dominated by state lenders, heavy institutions with heavy rules. Their pace is bureaucratic, their incentives are political, their risk tolerance is shaped by career ladders and inspection teams, and the demand for credit does not wait for committee meetings, so the gaps open. Not as a grand announcement, as a series of workarounds. A parallel system begins to grow in the seams: trusts, wealth management products, entrusted loans, off-balance sheet guarantees. It forms because it is useful, because it can do what the formal banks cannot do quickly enough, or cannot do publicly enough. It forms because the country's governing doctrine has made growth synonymous with stability, and stability is a clock that never stops. The stakes are immediate. If the credit machine keeps turning, jobs stay filled, construction continues, exports expand. If it stalls, the costs arrive fast: unpaid wages, half-built districts turning into desolation, local governments trapped between promises and empty accounts. A system built on acceleration cannot tolerate stillness. We come down into the places where this parallel oxygen is breathed. A coastal industrial zone at night. Sodium lights wash the road in dull orange. Trucks idle, engines vibrating through the asphalt, exhaust hanging low and acrid. The air smells of hot rubber, cooking oil from a late-night stall, and the sour edge of chemical runoff in a drainage ditch. Inside a factory, belts whir and fans clatter. Fluorescent lights buzz above rows of workers whose hands move with practiced economy. Calloused fingers, cracked knuckles, sleeves stained with grease that never fully washes out. On the other side of the country, a county seat inland. A new government building rises behind scaffolding, concrete dust chalking the boots of men who climb ladders with swollen feet. The site foreman's clipboard is damp from fog. The paper curls at the corners. A local official visits, coat collar turned up against the wind, cheeks red from cold. There is no speech here that matters more than the numbers. Jobs created, tax base expanded, unrest avoided. This is where the formal bank's slow rhythm becomes a liability. A state lender can insist on collateral and committee review, can ration loans in ways that satisfy inspectors. But the economy now demands speed. Bridge financing, short-term liquidity, quick expansion. When the formal system can't deliver, the parallel system does. Mechanism. Moment. How the shadow system actually moves money. A wealth management product might be sold at a bank counter or through an affiliate, marketed as a safe yield, short maturity, easy redemption. The funds are then routed, sometimes through trusts, sometimes through entrusted loans where one company lends to another via a bank as intermediary, into longer-term uses, property projects, industrial expansion, local financing vehicles. Guarantees are written off balance sheet so a risk can exist without appearing on the main books. The key is the mismatch. Borrow short, lend long, then roll the paper before it matures. The system survives by renewing itself. The paper is physical. It smells of ink and glue. Contracts come stapled, bound, sealed. Offices fill with stacks, thick reams pressed flat under paperweights. Printers chatter late into the evening. Rubber chops thud onto pages in steady rhythm, red marks blooming glossy and then drying to matte. A promise stamped today becomes leverage tomorrow. For financiers tied to the networks described in the last chapter, groups like Tomorrow, the parallel system is not an accident. It is terrain. Paper becomes power because paper is what regulators see first, what committees demand, what counterparties use to justify transfers. The right stamp on the right page can unlock property financing. A guarantee can turn a risky borrower into an acceptable one. a layered entity can keep exposure out of sight until it is too large to ignore. But every workaround drags a chain behind it. Liquidity becomes the ticking clock. Every month brings another stack of obligations that must be refinanced before confidence breaks. The sound of that clock is not a chime. It is the slam of file drawers, the rustle of pages, the vibration of a phone on a desk at midnight. If the rollover fails, it is not one company that suffers. It is a chain, contractors unpaid, suppliers squeezed, workers sent home, local government staring at half-finished concrete and still owing interest. Attrition appears in small, ugly ways. A developer delays wages, the canteen serves thinner soup, dormitory bunks creak as men shift in restless sleep. A cough spreads in damp rooms, a truck sits idle because a payment didn't clear. Doubt, once it enters, spreads like smoke through a stairwell. Now we cut tight to the motif of this chapter. Twine-bound contracts on a desk, each page marked by a red chop. The twine is rough, fibres fraying where fingers have pulled it tight. The paper edges are uneven, some sheets slightly warped from humidity. A desk lamp throws hard light across the stack. Dust floats in the beam. The room smells of stale tea, cigarette ash, and the sharp chemical bite of stamp ink. A hand flips pages slowly. The fingertips are stained faintly red. The chops are fresh enough to glint. Paper stack slams shut. The sound is heavy, final, and it lands like a warning. Because the system holds only as long as growth outruns doubt, and doubt does not need a revolution to spread. Only a missed rollover, a delayed payout, a single policy shift that turns a routine refinancing into a dead end. The parallel system grows because it answers a demand that doesn't negotiate. In the 2000s, China's credit appetite expands with construction and export revenue, and the formal banking system, still dominated by state lenders, remains too slow, too cautious, too politically constrained to satisfy the tempo of local ambitions. Coastal exporters pile up cash, inland governments chase factories to keep young men employed, developers race to pour concrete before land prices lift again. Each actor is solving a short-term problem with long-term consequences. Keep the line running, keep the site active, keep the payroll paid. The shadow system becomes oxygen, but oxygen can also feed fire. The ticking clock is liquidity, and it does not care about plans. Each month arrives with maturities, redemptions, interest payments, paper obligations stacked like bricks. The rollover must happen again, and again. A system that borrows short and lends long is always walking on thin ice, no matter how confident the stride. It holds as long as growth outruns doubt. But the distance between confidence and panic can be a single memo. We drop into a bank branch on a weekday afternoon. The air is dry, warmed by heaters, smelling of floor polish and stale cigarette smoke trapped in coats. A line forms beneath flickering fluorescent lights. A poster promises steady returns in clean fonts. At the counter, a clerk taps a stamp pad, then presses a red chop onto subscription papers. Thud, lift, thud, each mark blooming glossy before it begins to dry. The printer rattles, spitting out forms that curl slightly at the edges from heat. A woman signs, pen scratching cheap paper. A man folds his copy into a worn wallet. Someone coughs into a sleeve. Small movements. Ordinary. Yet the money gathered here is the first breath in a long chain. Outside, dusk settles on a city of cranes. Concrete dust coats the curb. The smell of diesel exhaust and hot asphalt lingers. Trucks grind through traffic, hauling rebar and drywall, their beds clanging. On a construction site, workers in thin jackets shift sacks of cement, hands cracked and raw, wrists wrapped in cloth. Their lunch tins are empty. Their wages depend on financing that depends on paper that depends on confidence. Mechanism. Moment. The pipeline from short money to long exposure. A wealth management product is sold with a short maturity, weeks, months, promising a yield that beats deposits. The funds are pooled and routed into longer projects through trusts or entrusted loans. Entrusted loans move through banks as intermediaries. One company lends to another, the bank handles the transfer and paperwork, collecting fees without carrying the loan on its balance sheet like a standard bank loan. Off-balance sheet guarantees add a second layer. An affiliated entity promises to cover losses if the borrower fails, making the deal look safer than it is. The borrower uses the money for long-term assets, property land purchases, infrastructure projects, expansion that will not generate cash fast enough to repay without refinancing. The rollover is not optional, it is the entire structure. So every month becomes a test, not of profitability but of timing. A trust product matures, a developer needs to repay. The developer cannot repay from sales yet. The solution is another product, another loan, another guarantee. Paper replaces cash, liquidity becomes faith, and faith becomes routine. Then friction arrives. A circular tightens definitions. A regulator questions an off-balance sheet exposure. A bank branch is told to reduce certain products, or to reclassify risk, or to slow issuance. The change may be minor on paper. In practice, it is a choke point. The pipeline constricts. The next rollover becomes harder. In offices, the response is immediate and physical. Phones ringing, spreadsheets printed, contracts rechecked, seals applied to amended terms. The air smells of hot toner and ink solvent. Stacks of documents lean in unstable piles. A manager's tie is loosened. His fingers are stained with stamp ink. His eyes are rimmed red from sleeplessness. No private thoughts are needed. The strain is in the pace. Attrition follows the constriction. A contractor doesn't get paid on time and sends fewer workers the next day. A supplier demands cash up front. A site slows. The concrete pour is delayed and rebar rusts in wet air. Wages slip. In dormitories, wood bunks creak as men shift awake, coughing in damp rooms. A canteen serves thinner soup. A rumour moves through the line like a cold draft. Payments delayed, redemptions uncertain, a product restructured. Doubt enters not as ideology, but as arithmetic. Will the money return when promised? We cut to the meeting that tries to hold the whole thing together. A hotel conference room, carpet patterned to hide stains. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the sweet, sharp bite of alcohol from glass is set down too hard. On the table, folders, ledgers, stamped agreements, a calculator clicking under someone's thumb. Men lean over schedules, maturity dates circled in red pen, rollover plans mapped week by week. The mood is not celebratory, it is triage. Paper becomes power here because paper is what keeps the machine breathing. A promise stamped today can unlock property tomorrow. A guarantee can keep an investor calm for another cycle. A layered entity can absorb risk long enough to push it forward. But the system's spine is still confidence, and confidence is fragile when the clock is monthly. Historical ambiguity, the precise internal risk recognition, how fully participants understood systemic rollover dependency at the time, varied across institutions and remains debated due to limited transparency and retrospective bias. Now we cut tight to the moment when the machine nearly coughs. Twine-bound contracts spread across a desk, pages marked with red chops. The twine is pulled tight, fibers rough against skin. The ink is fresh on a new addendum, glossy, wet, smelling sharp and chemical. A hand flips to the maturity page. The date is close, too close. A phone vibrates, then stops. A drawer opens with a metallic rasp. An envelope is slid inside and sealed. Paper stack slams shut. The sound is a blunt threat. Because if one policy shock turns a routine rollover into a refusal, the oxygen becomes poison, and the whole credit experiment learns what addiction feels like. By the mid to late 2000s, the parallel credit system is no longer a workaround. It is load-bearing. China's coast has been running hot on export demand. Containers moving, factories humming, cash piling up in corporate accounts. Inland, local governments keep chasing industry, because employment is not just economics, it is stability. On winter days, the air still tastes of coal grit, and the wind comes in hard, scraping cheeks raw, rattling loose window frames in half-finished districts. Growth has become a governing doctrine, and doctrine creates momentum. Momentum creates obligations. Then the outside world stumbles. A global shock, credit seizing elsewhere, orders collapsing, uncertainty moving across oceans faster than ships, doesn't need to be named in slogans to be felt. It lands in the port first. Fewer containers, quieter docks, cranes paused mid-swing. It lands in the factory next. Shorter shifts, dimmer workshops, the smell of machine oil still thick but the cadence changed. And it lands last where it hurts most. In the monthly calendar of maturities, where promises stamped weeks ago must be honoured now, regardless of what the world has decided. This is the fracture line the system has lived on all along. Borrow short, lend long, roll the paper. It works when confidence is plentiful and growth outruns doubt. When either slows, the oxygen turns thin. We move into the city where the chain is felt hand to hand. A bank branch on a grey afternoon, fluorescent lights buzz. The air smells of floor polish and damp wool steaming off coats. A line of customers forms, shoes squeaking on tile. On the counter, subscription documents are stacked and squared by a clerk with ink-stained fingers. The rubber chop comes down, thud, leaving fresh red marks that glint wet before they dull. A printer chatters, spitting out pages that curl at the edges. Someone coughs into a sleeve. Someone taps a foot, impatient, anxious, listening for any hint of delay. Across town, a developer's office. The radiator clanks and the room is stale with cold tea and cigarette ash. A calendar on the wall has dates circled in red. Maturity dates, repayment dates, rollover dates. A ledger lies open, its spine cracked, pages smudged where sweaty thumbs have turned them too fast. A model of a new residential tower sits on a table, dust gathering on its plastic windows. Mechanism. Moment. What happens when the rollover meets a shock? Short maturity products come due. Investors expect redemption. The funds are tied up in long assets, land, concrete, infrastructure, assets that cannot be sold quickly without taking losses. To pay redemptions, issuers must refinance, sell a new product, secure a new entrusted loan, trigger a guarantee, or persuade a bank intermediary to process another transfer. If issuance slows, because regulators tighten, because banks pull back, because investors hesitate, the chain strains. A single weak link becomes a cascade. One missed repayment forces another, one delayed transfer freezes a payroll, one temporary extension becomes a confession that liquidity is not cash, it is belief. Attrition shows up immediately on the ground. On a construction site, rebar rusts under wet tarps. Concrete trucks idle, engines vibrating because a payment didn't clear. Workers in thin jackets rub cracked hands together for warmth, breath white in the air, lunch tins lighter than they should be. In dormitories, wooden bunks creak as men turn in sleep, coughing in damp rooms where laundry never fully dries. A canteen pot simmers thin broth that smells faintly of cabbage and oil, and the line moves slower because the mood has changed. The response from above is forceful, because it has to be. Growth is legitimacy. Legitimacy must be defended. Policy moves. Credit is pushed or pulled. Banks are instructed. Local governments are told to keep projects alive, to keep employment steady, to keep the ground from shifting underfoot. The state can widen formal lending and tighten certain channels in the same breath, trying to redirect oxygen without letting the patient gasp. The rules remain movable, circulars arriving like cold fronts, and the market learns again what it learned in the 1990s. When the wall can move, you survive by being near the hands that move it. Historical ambiguity. The true scale of off-balance sheet guarantees and their interconnections in the pre-crisis years is difficult to measure precisely due to reporting limits and deliberate opacity. Now we cut tight to the place where the addiction is written down. Twine-bound contracts on a desk. The twine rough and fraying where fingers have pulled it tight. Each page is marked by a red chop. Some marks are old and matte, others fresh and glossy, still smelling sharp, ink, solvent and rubber. The paper edges are uneven, slightly warped from humidity. A desk lamp throws hard light across the stack. Dust floats in the beam. A thumb turns a page, leaves a faint smear where the ink hasn't fully set. A maturity schedule lies beneath. Dates, amounts, counterparties, lined up like teeth. The month is ending. The next month is already waiting. Mechanism. Moment. Rollover as habit becomes rollover as dependency. When short funding repeatedly covers long exposure, the system stops treating refinancing as an emergency measure and starts treating it as normal operations. That normality changes behavior. Risk is tolerated, leverage grows, guarantees multiply, and paperwork becomes a substitute for resilience. It can endure ordinary stress. It cannot endure a clean refusal because a refusal is not a loss on one deal. It is a stoppage of breathing. A hand gathers the contracts into a stack. The twine bites into the skin. The paper smells dry, dusty, faintly sweet with cheap glue. The red chops stare back, precise and indifferent. Paper stack slams shut, and in that slam is the bridge forward. A credit experiment that learned to survive by rolling promises now finds itself needing the roll just to remain upright. So when the global crisis arrives, it doesn't merely test the system, it teaches it to crave more. The blast wave from 2008 is felt in China first as silence. On the coast, export engines sputter, orders thin. Warehouses that had been loud with forklifts and shouting turn quieter, the air smelling of cardboard, diesel, and cold metal. Ships still sit in harbours, but the rhythm changes. Fewer containers, longer pauses, a slackening that travels inland like a chill through bone. The West contracts, demand collapses, credit dries, and for a country whose legitimacy is lashed to growth, contraction is not a statistic, it is a threat. Beijing responds with a decision that carries the weight of sovereignty. Outrun unemployment, outrun unrest, outrun doubt. A credit surge follows, fast, enormous, meant to keep factories alive, to keep construction moving, to keep millions of migrants paid, fed, and hopeful. The geopolitical effect is immediate. As others shrink, China projects competence, steadiness, a capacity to act. Leverage shifts in global trade not only because of production, but because of posture, the ability to spend when others cannot. The air in the capital is thick with winter smog, the sun a pale disk at noon, and the city's machinery turns with renewed urgency. Money floods into rail lines and highways, into bridges and tunnels, and, inevitably, into real estate. Cranes multiply across the skyline like steel forests, their booms turning through dusk haze. Concrete becomes the language of reassurance, visible, countable, employable. Growth becomes not only policy again, but emergency doctrine. The stakes are social and immediate. If millions of migrants go unpaid, they do not simply vanish. They return to villages already hollowed by attrition. They gather in stations and dorm corridors. They become a pressure that cannot be legislated away. The ticking clock is not quarterly, it is daily. We cut into the capital's working day. A ministry building on a grey morning, security gates, damp wool coats, the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to hallways. Fluorescent lights buzz above stacks of documents. Project lists, funding requests, approvals waiting for red chops. Phones ring with clipped urgency. Printers chatter. Meetings run long. The air is stale with tea and toner. The crisis outside is global, but the response here is mechanical and concrete. Make money move. Mechanism moment. How the credit surge is delivered. The state pushes lending through the banking system. Directives that encourage or require state lenders to expand credit rapidly, channeling funds into infrastructure projects and policy priorities. The money does not drop from the sky. It is booked as loans, dispersed to entities that can spend fast. Those entities are often local governments and their proxies, platforms that can sign contracts, hire contractors, and pour concrete before the political window closes. The proof of movement is paper. Loan agreements, disbursement schedules, guarantees, stamped approvals. The sound of the mechanism is steady. Stamp, 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 red ink drying while funds are released. We move outward to the city's edge where the lending turns into labour. A rail project site in winter fog. Rebar stands like ribs, frost clinging to steel. Cement dust coats boots, generators thrum. A foreman's clipboard is damp. The paper curls at the corners. Men in thin jackets carry loads, their hands cracked and raw, breath white in the cold. A truck backs up with a grinding beep, dumping gravel that crunches underfoot. The smell is sharp, diesel, wet concrete, and the sour edge of sweat trapped under layers. This is why infrastructure becomes the first refuge. It absorbs labour quickly. It produces visible progress. It signals competence. It also creates obligations that will linger long after the crisis headlines fade. But the flood cannot be contained in rail lines and highways. It spills. Local governments are boxed in by fiscal rules, limited in their formal ability to borrow, pressured to deliver growth and stability anyway. So they lean on financing vehicles and land sales. The cranes rise, the skyline thickens. The boom becomes a kind of public reassurance. Look, the country is still moving. Attrition is prevented by motion. That is the logic. Keep the sites active, the payroll flowing, the dorms occupied, and it works, until it doesn't. Because every loan is a future claim, every project a future maintenance burden, every land sale a future dependency. In the rush to outrun unemployment, the system deepens a culture of leverage. Borrowing as default, refinancing as routine, paperwork as proof of safety. Now we cut to the household, where the flood becomes intimate. A small apartment kitchen in Beijing smog season. The window is filmed with grey dust. A kettle whistles faintly. On the table sits a bank booklet, a stack of receipts, and a glossy brochure showing an apartment tower that does not yet exist. Only rebar in winter fog, only a fenced pit with machinery. The air smells of cooking oil and coal smoke that has seeped into curtains. A hand counts notes, crisp bills that feel thin but heavy with consequence, then folds them into an envelope. The paper crackles. The envelope is sealed. Outside, at dusk, tower cranes turn through the haze, their lights blinking like distant warning points. The city hums, traffic muffled by smog, engines low, horns dulled. Concrete becomes the new savings vessel. Deposits are paid. Speculative flips begin. Hope is poured into buildings that are still skeletal frames. The ticking clock is social. Millions must be kept working, kept paid, kept from losing faith. And as the cranes turn, the question sharpens in the smog. How long can a country outrun crisis with debt before the debt becomes the crisis? 2018 does not feel like recovery. It feels like counterattack. Across the Atlantic, credit has seized and confidence has cracked. Factories elsewhere dim their lights, ports idle, orders evaporate into spreadsheets and cancellations. On China's coast, the change is audible. Fewer forklifts beeping in cavernous warehouses, fewer container doors slammed shut, a hollower echo under corrugated roofs that smell of cardboard and diesel. In Beijing, the response is not hesitant. It is indomitable. The state leans into the only lever it trusts to prevent social rupture: credit, released fast enough to outrun unemployment. The geopolitical effect hardens quickly. While rivals contract, China projects competence. Rail lines laid, highways extended, urban districts rising in smog. Trade partners take note. Leverage shifts not only through production, but through the ability to spend when others cannot, to keep demand alive while the rest of the system coughs. Sovereignty becomes performance under pressure. Maintain stability, maintain growth, maintain control. 3 imperatives, all expensive. But the flood has its own physics. Money, once loosed, seeks speed. It finds the shortest channel into concrete. It finds rail and road first, then towers, then land. Because land is the most visible collateral in a country building at scale. And as dusk falls over Beijing, cranes turn through the smog in slow arcs, their warning lights blinking faint red through haze that smells of coal ash and wet cement. We move down into the municipal engine room where the doctrine becomes paperwork. A district government office. Fluorescent lights buzz, radiators clank, damp wool coats steam faintly as they hang on chairbacks. Desks are crowded with stamped project lists, financing applications, land use maps with corners curled from handling, the air taste of cold tea and toner. Phones ring in short bursts. Outside the window, traffic grinds through grey slush, horns muted by smog. Local governments are boxed in by fiscal rules, yet demanded to deliver growth and employment. The hard choice is immediate: accept slowdown and risk unrest, or borrow and build and accept the debt. Most choose motion, they choose cranes. Mechanism. Moment, the local financing vehicle and the land sale loop. A local government sets up a platform, an entity that can borrow even when the government itself is constrained. The platform pledges land or future land sale revenue as collateral, then takes loans from banks or issues debt through channels that feel administrative rather than market-driven. The borrowed money pays contractors to build roads, subways, industrial parks, projects that create jobs now and, in theory, raise land values later. The land is then sold or auctioned, producing revenue used to service debt and fund more building. The loop is blunt. Borrow against land, build to lift land, sell land to repay borrowing. It holds as long as prices rise and lenders remain calm. We cut to a land auction hall. The room is warm and dry, smelling of sweat trapped under suits, and the faint spice of cigarettes clinging to collars. A stack of documents sits on a table, parcel numbers, reserve prices, sealed bids. A clerk's fingers are ink-stained. The red chop hits paper with a flat thud. Sealed envelopes slide across wood. Outside, wind pushes grit along the curb, and a developer's black sedan idles, exhaust curling into the cold. The flood reaches construction sites in days. A highway project on the outskirts. Rebar rusts where it's been left in wet air. Cement dust coats boots and eyelashes. A generator thrums steady. Migrant workers eat from metal tins. Rice gone cold, bread flecked with ash from nearby fires, then climb back onto scaffolding. Their hands are calloused, knuckles cracked, wrists wrapped in cloth. Attrition is managed by speed. Keep them working, keep them paid, keep them from drifting back inland with nothing but swollen feet and anger. And yet the spillover is inevitable. Rail and road do not absorb all the money. Real estate does what it always does in a credit flood. It multiplies claims. Now we cut tight to the household level, where policy becomes personal weight. A sales office near a new development. Bright lights, glossy models, air perfume with fresh paint and cheap floral cleaner. Outside the glass doors, winter fog sits low. You can smell wet concrete and diesel from trucks reversing with a grinding beep. On the table, contracts are stacked and squared. Pages bound at the corner, each one marked with a red chop that glints wet before it dries. A pen scratches across paper, receipts are stamped. An envelope of savings is opened and counted. Crisp notes that crackle then disappear into a cashier's drawer with a dull click. For households, life tilts toward concrete. Deposits become a form of security. Speculative flips become plausible. Savings that once sat in bank books are poured into apartments that are still skeletal frames, rebar ribs inside fog. The hard choice sits on the table. Keep money liquid and earn little, or lock it into property and accept the risk that the market and the policy mood can turn. Mechanism. Moment. Pre-sales and the time gap. Developers sell units before completion, collecting deposits and down payments that fund ongoing construction and service existing debt. Buyers accept paper promises, contracts, delivery dates, stamped guarantees, while the building remains unfinished. The system depends on timing. Sales today fund concrete tomorrow. New deposits help cover old obligations. When sales slow, liquidity tightens. When liquidity tightens, construction delays. When construction delays, confidence frays. Time-lapse cranes over skyline. At dusk, their booms swing through Beijing smog, lights blinking like faint embers in grey air. The city keeps building because it cannot easily stop. It builds for jobs. It builds for legitimacy. It builds to outrun doubt. And the question that sharpens with every stamped contract is simple and brutal. If the flood becomes habit, what happens when the next shock arrives and the water stops rising? Time-lapse cranes over skyline. Beijing at dusk, smog thick enough to turn the horizon into a smear. The sun a dim coin behind particulate haze. Tower cranes rotate in slow arcs, warning lights blinking red through grey air that smells of coal ash and wet cement. The credit flood has done what it was meant to do. The export shock does not become mass idleness, on a scale that would risk open rupture. The ports recover their rhythm, the factories relight, the construction sites keep humming. From the outside it reads as competence. While others contract, China expands rail lines, highways and housing blocks at a pace that shifts leverage in global trade. Observers note the contrast, a country willing to spend its way through crisis, projecting steadiness when rival economies are in retreat. The geopolitical effect is real, and it is immediate. New infrastructure, new capacity, new bargaining weight. But the cost is baked into the method. Debt is not a side effect, it is the instrument. When you fight a contraction by forcing credit outward, you win time. Time against unemployment, time against unrest, time against the corrosive doubt that eats legitimacy. Yet time bought this way is never free. It arrives with interest. The ticking clock remains social. Millions of migrants must be paid, fed, and kept hopeful. And now there is another clock, quieter but sharper. Repayment schedules accumulating like frost on wire. We come down into the cities where the flood leaves a residue you can touch. A new district on the edge of town, sidewalks poured yesterday, still chalky with cement dust. Shop fronts waiting for tenants, wind pushing grit into doorways. The air carries diesel exhaust and the sour note of damp insulation. A bus stops beside a site fence. Men step off with lunch tins and battered bags, boots crunching gravel. Their hands are calloused, knuckles split, sleeves streaked with grease. A foreman checks a list on a clipboard whose paper curls at the corners in cold fog. In the municipal offices behind them, the paperwork piles higher. Radiators clank. Fluorescent lights buzz. The smell is cold tea, toner, cigarette ash trapped in coats. Desks are crowded with land maps, loan schedules, stamped approvals. Local governments, boxed in by fiscal rules yet commanded to deliver growth, learn to rely on the same loop again and again. Build, sell land, borrow more, build again. It prevents desolation now, but it calcifies dependence. Mechanism, moment, refinancing as routine. Loans used to fund infrastructure and property must be rolled when they mature. New borrowing replaces old, and land sales become the cash bridge that keeps payments current. If land prices rise, the loop looks indomitable. If land sales slow, the loop turns into a quagmire. Projects half finished, interest due, contractors unpaid. Banks extend terms, shift classifications, and keep credit flowing because stopping would expose losses and trigger panic. The system stays upright by refusing to sit down. The real estate spillover thickens this dependence. Households tilt toward concrete as a store of value. Sales offices stay bright even in winter haze. Glossy models under harsh lights. Air perfumed with fresh paint and cheap floral cleaner. Contracts are stacked, squared, stamped. The red chops glint wet, then dry to matte. Buyers hand over envelopes of savings. Cash crackles, then disappears into drawers that lock with a dull click. The promise is physical, a unit number, a delivery date, a stamped receipt. Attrition is not gone, it is displaced. It shows up as swollen feet on long commutes, as coughs in damp dorm rooms where bunks creak under restless sleep, as ash in bread eaten fast beside a site fence. It shows up in families who stretch budgets to make deposits, betting that property will hold when everything else feels uncertain. It shows up in officials who keep signing because the alternative is slowdown, and slowdown threatens stability, the one thing the doctrine cannot risk. And so the culture of leverage deepens. Borrowing becomes normal. Refinancing becomes normal. Paper becomes reassurance. Now we cut tight to the object that binds the whole era together, a mortgage contract and a pre-sale agreement on a kitchen table. The room is small, heated unevenly. The window is filmed with grey dust from smog days, and the air smells of cooking oil and coal smoke embedded in curtains. A kettle ticks as it cools. On the paper, red chops sit like bruises, precise, official, indifferent. The pages are slightly rough under the fingertips, fibres catching on dry skin. A bank booklet lies open beside it, numbers written cleanly, the ink crisp and unforgiving. Mechanism. Moment. The household balance sheet becomes part of the national engine. Down payments and monthly repayments channel savings into property. Developers use pre-sale cash to fund construction and service debt. Local governments rely on land revenue generated by the same property demand. Banks book loans that assume continued repayment and continued values. Each part steadies the other until one part falters, and the steadiness reveals itself as mutual dependence. A hand presses the paper flat, not to admire it, to keep it from curling. A thumb pauses over a red stamp where the ink has fully dried, leaving a faint raised texture you can feel. Outside, the cranes keep turning through Beijing's smog at dusk. Booms rotating, lights blinking, steel silhouettes cutting slow arcs above half-finished towers. The country has outrun the crisis, but it has also trained itself to survive by acceleration. And when the leadership changes hands, it inherits a machine that does not idle easily, because every attempt to slow risks snapping the paper chain that is holding the weight. Beijing, 2012. Winter presses down like a lid. Smog thickens the air until the sun is a pale disk, and the cold carries a dry metallic bite that sits on the tongue. Ring roads grind with traffic, engines low, horns dulled by haze, while inside compounds the leadership transition arrives with a promise that sounds simple and lands heavy: discipline. Corruption, framed by the new top leadership as an existential threat to the party's survival, becomes the problem that cannot be postponed without risking sovereignty itself. This is not merely moral theatre, it is institutional self-preservation after decades of accelerated growth, leverage culture, and patronage networks that kept capitalism functioning inside a political system that refuses to loosen its grip. By now, the old stabilization bargain, wealth in exchange for quiet, has calcified into a governing reflex. But patronage has a cost. It leaves paper trails, it leaves factions, it leaves an elite that knows too much about how the machine really runs. So the enforcement state expands. Investigations are promised to reach senior officials as well as minor cadres, tigers and flies in official language, and the message is meant to travel faster than rumour. The ticking clock is loyalty. Who will be the next example, and how quickly will everyone else adjust before the knock comes to their corridor? The stakes are immediate. If the campaign is weak, it invites cynicism. If it is strong, it risks paralysis and internal fracture. Either way, the party is choosing to tighten control at the exact moment the economy is still loaded with debt from the post-2008 flood. The country cannot easily slow down. Yet now the system is telling its own gatekeepers to fear themselves. We descend into the working texture of that fear. A hotel lobby near the financial district. Carpet damp at the edges from tracked-in slush. Air warm and stale with cigarette smoke clinging to wool coats. A cluster of men in dark suits stand too close to a column, speaking low, not performing confidence the way they used to. Meetings grow shorter, handshakes are quicker, palms dry. In restaurants, private rooms once booked for long banquets sit half-used. The clink of glasses is quieter, the smell of alcohol still hangs, but the laughter is thinner. Across town, a government office corridor hums under fluorescent lights. Paper stacks sit on metal shelves, corners curled, stamped covers mottled red. A clerk's fingers are ink-stained. A rubber chop lands with a flat thud, then lifts, leaving wet marks that glint before they dry. The radiator clanks. A kettle ticks as it cools. The air tastes of cold tea and toner. Mechanism. Moment. This campaign is driven first through internal party discipline. Investigations conducted by disciplinary bodies such as the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, CCDI, backed by inspection teams that can arrive unannounced and demand files, accounts, contacts. Party discipline has its own procedures and can take precedence over ordinary legal processes while an official is being questioned, collapsing the distance between politics and law in practical terms. The method is institutional pressure, applied where it hurts: careers, networks, and the ability to dispense favours. Inspection teams spread across regions and bureaucracies, and the apparatus openly cultivates intimidation as a tool, fear as policy, not as accident. A mid-level official who once signed approvals with ease now hesitates over a file, pen hovering, aware that a signature is not just a decision, but evidence. This is the fracture line running through the elite itself. The same patronage networks that stabilize capital flows now look like liabilities. A favor is no longer a quiet lubricant. It is a potential charge. A relationship is no longer an asset. It is a risk exposure. The business class feels it immediately. More paperwork, more deniability, more intermediaries. Contracts become thicker. Meeting minutes become sterile. Sealed envelopes, still used, are handled like live wires. Attrition follows in human form. Officials retire early. Projects stall because nobody wants to be the signatory. A local bureau delays a permit for review, and the delay becomes a month, then a season. Officials grow reluctant to make decisions under sustained scrutiny, paralysed not by ideology, but by self-preservation. And still the clock keeps ticking. The campaign cannot pause without looking weak. It cannot accelerate without breaking something inside the system that runs the country. Now the camera tightens to the moment where discipline becomes physical. A quiet hotel corridor at night. The carpet muffles footsteps. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and stale smoke embedded in fabric. A door stands shut, light leaking in a thin line at the frame. Inside, a television murmurs low, then goes silent. Door gap, Envelope slides. A sealed envelope glides across the carpet and stops against the baseboard. The paper is thick, edges sharp. Fresh glue catches the light. No words are shown because the effect is already complete. The envelope is the knock without the knock. It collapses distance, between rumour and accusation, between privilege and peril. A hand reaches down, hesitates, then lifts it. The seal resists for a second before giving. The sound is small. The consequence is not. Somewhere else another file drawer closes. Somewhere else another stamp lands. The red mark dries, and the loyalty clock advances one notch. The net tightens after 2012, and Beijing feels it first, not as a headline, as a change in posture. The capital's winter smog turns the skyline into a grey smear, and the air carries that familiar bite, coal grit and cold metal on the tongue. In that air, the party's new leadership frames corruption as an existential threat, and the anti-graft apparatus expands with a scope meant to be unmistakable. Senior tigers as well as minor flies. The turning point is not only in who is targeted, but in what the campaign becomes, a governing instrument. It reaches into ministries, provinces, state firms, the security organs, any place where patronage once moved money and permissions. Central inspection teams are dispatched, and their arrival lands like weather, sudden, unavoidable, chilling. Then a taboo breaks. A former top security chief, Zhou Yongkang, is investigated. A move widely reported as unprecedented at that level in the post-Cultural Revolution era. The message is not subtle. No network is too senior to be exposed. No retirement is thick enough to be armor. And once that message is credible, the clock starts running on everyone else. Loyalty becomes time-sensitive. Align fast or be isolated. Admit nothing or be consumed by your own paper trail. The net does not need to catch everyone to change everyone. We cut to the spaces where discipline becomes daily life. A restaurant private room that used to host long banquets now closes early. The air still smells of oil and tobacco trapped in curtains, but the noise is lower. Fewer toasts, fewer loud clinks of glass. A waiter wipes a table that never filled, cloth dragging across lacquer with a soft rasp. Austerity-linked drops in official spending on meetings, overseas trips, vehicle purchases, numbers that sound bureaucratic until you stand in an empty room and hear the silence. Down the street, a government corridor under fluorescent lights. Damp wool coats steam faintly on chairbacks. A radiator ticks and clanks. The air tastes of cold tea and toner. Metal filing cabinets line the wall, drawers opening with a gritty scrape. A clerk flips through a folder, fingertips ink-stained, and a red chop lands on paper with a flat thud, then lifts, leaving a wet mark that glints before it dries. Mechanism. Moment. Internal party discipline as pressure, not as courtroom process. The Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, and its local arms, can investigate party members under internal rules, using procedures that sit beside and often ahead of ordinary criminal process. In earlier years of the campaign, that could involve secretive detention methods such as shuangui, described by human rights reporting as isolating subjects at a designated time and place, outside normal legal safeguards. The effect is blunt. The distance between politics and law collapses in practice. A disciplinary case can become a criminal case, but the first gate is political. In this climate, the business class recalculates in real time. Meetings shorten, email chains get longer, deals acquire layers, more compliance memos, more signatures, more clean intermediaries. A contract is still paper, but now it is also liability. A relationship that once stabilized capitalism now looks like exposure. A name in a guest list, a photo of a banquet place card, a travel record, a transfer that can be read as favor. Dossiers are built from details as small as banquet nameplates, tiny artifacts turned into evidence. Hard choice. Stay small and safe, or keep expanding and accept that any expansion increases your surface area. More counterparties, more approvals, more points where an investigator can apply pressure. Staying small means forfeiting scale in an economy still built on scale. Growing means gambling that your patrons will remain protected. Attrition follows. It is procedural and slow, but it bites. Officials become reluctant to sign. Projects stall because no one wants to be the signature at the bottom of a risky approval. Decisions are delayed until the season passes, and the delay becomes its own kind of punishment. Costs rising, workers idled, supply chains kinked. Officials are frozen by scrutiny, fear turning into inertia. Now we cut to the moment the net becomes personal. A hotel corridor at night, carpet swallowing footsteps. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and stale smoke embedded in fabric. Light leaks from a doorframe in a thin line. The building is quiet enough that you can hear an elevator cable hum somewhere deep in the shaft. Door gap, envelope slides. A sealed envelope glides under the door and stops against the baseboard. The paper is thick. The flap is glued tight. A hand reaches down, hesitates, then lifts it. The seal resists for a beat, then tears with a dry, fibrous sound. No dialogue, no confession, just the soft rip of paper and the sudden weight of consequence. The loyalty clock accelerates because the message travels faster than due process ever could. One investigation becomes 10 rumours. One rumour becomes 100 cancellations. A banquet table sits empty. A loan committee waits for guidance. A financier rereads a contract by desk lamp, smelling ink solvent and cold tea, noticing, too late, how many names are attached. And the question that starts to hang over every balance sheet is a brutal one. If patronage has turned from stabilizer to liability, what happens when fear hits the market itself and money begins to bolt? By the time the campaign has traction, the capital's air feels heavier than smog alone can explain. Beijing winters still press down with that familiar mix. Cold grit in the throat, cold metal on the tongue, the sun reduced to a dull coin behind haze. But now there is another weight, a bureaucracy taught to anticipate impact. The anti-graft apparatus expands not only in reach but in atmosphere, and the atmosphere changes the country's risk calculus as surely as a rate hike. A state that once tolerated informal lubrication to keep the growth machine turning is now warning its own operators that lubrication can be treated as rot. The immediate fallout is not a single dramatic rupture. It is a tightening everywhere at once. Patronage networks that once stabilized capitalism become liabilities. A system that ran on closeness begins to punish evidence of closeness. The fracture line runs through the elite itself, cadres, executives, financiers, people who have lived by access and now must learn to live by distance. The ticking clock is loyalty, and loyalty is time-sensitive. A line before the next list is drawn up. Cut ties before the next inspection team arrives. If the message is meant to travel fast, it does. Faster than any formal directive, carried by cancellations, by closed doors, by the sudden silence of phones that used to ring. We move into the daily mechanics of fear. A mid-level bureau office at dusk. Fluorescent lights buzz, radiators clank. The air smells of cold tea and paper dust. A stack of files sits on a desk, edges scuffed, corners curled from too many hands. A clerk's stamp hits a page, flat thud, leaving a wet red mark that glints for a moment before drying into matte crust. The sound repeats down the corridor like a metronome. Drawers scraping open, folders sliding, signatures landing with a dry rasp of pen on cheap paper. Mechanism, moment. Institutional pressure works by making every step traceable, and every trace punishable. Internal discipline inspections demand records, meeting logs, expense receipts, travel approvals, gift registries, project sign-offs, then compare them against each other. The objective is not only to prove wrongdoing, it is to demonstrate that discretion has limits and that gatekeeping can be reversed. When the distance between politics and law collapses, procedural decisions become perilous. The same approval that keeps a project moving can later be read as favoritism. The same introduction that once greased a deal can be framed as collusion. For business, daily life shifts into shorter horizons. Meetings become brief and sterile. Paperwork thickens. Deniability becomes a requirement you can feel in the room. Extra attendees, extra memos, extra signatures spaced out across multiple desks, so no one hand looks decisive. A deal that once moved on relationships now needs documentation that can survive hostile reading. In hotel lobbies, men in dark suits sit farther apart, shoulders tight, eyes scanning. The air smells of disinfectant and stale smoke embedded in carpet. A phone vibrates once, then is silenced. A handshake happens quickly, palms dry, then hands disappear into pockets. Hard choice returns in new form. Keep expanding and accept that scale increases exposure, or slow down and risk being left behind in a market still built on velocity. Slowing can look like prudence. It can also look like weakness. Expanding can look like ambition. It can also look like a trail. Attrition follows, and it is costly because it is invisible until it isn't. Approvals stall because nobody wants to be the signature. Credit committees delay for review. Projects miss seasonal windows. A foundation pour is postponed into colder weather. Rebar sits under wet tarps and starts to rust. Migrant workers wait on site fences with lunch tins, breath white in the cold, hands cracked and raw, while foremen check their phones and say only that payments are late. In dormitories, wooden bunks creak as bodies turn in restless sleep, cough spreading in damp air that never fully dries. Historical ambiguity, the exact share of China's slowdown in administrative decision-making during these years attributable to anti-graft pressure versus broader economic factors, remains debated. Still, the pressure is plain. The enforcement state is not only catching individuals, it is reshaping incentives. It teaches officials to fear initiative. It teaches financiers to fear proximity. It teaches everyone to treat paper not as mere procedure, but as a potential weapon. Now we cut tight to the way the message arrives. A hotel corridor at night. Carpet muffles footsteps. The air is faintly sour with stale smoke and cleaning chemicals. Light leaks under a door in a thin strip. Somewhere, an elevator cable hums deep in the shaft. Door gap, envelope slides. A sealed envelope slips across the carpet and stops against the baseboard. Thick paper, sharp edges, glue still holding tight. A hand reaches down and lifts it carefully, as if it might stain. The seal tears with a dry, fibrous sound. Inside, the contents are not shown, because the content is secondary to the function. The envelope is proof that the net can reach through private space and make it public. The business class learns the new arithmetic. Patronage no longer stabilizes, it endangers. Deals no longer hinge only on price, they hinge on exposure. And the country, still carrying the leverage culture built in the credit flood years, now has a second force pulling on it. Fear, tightening liquidity not by interest rates alone, but by hesitation. Beyond the smog-dark skyline, money is still moving. But it is moving differently, more brittle, more reactive, more prone to bolt. And when the markets begin to convulse in 2015, the lesson of the net will be waiting there already. Control can be tightened overnight, confidence can evaporate by morning, and paper promises can turn to ash without a single brick being laid. Summer 2015. China's cities sweat under heat that clings to concrete. In the evenings, the air smells of street oil and hot asphalt, and the glow of apartment windows looks like a grid of small furnaces. Inside those windows, another heat builds. Blue light from televisions and phones, the faint ozone tang of electronics running too long, too late. The numbers on the screens begin to matter the way weather matters, not as theory, but as pressure. A stock boom swells, fed by margin lending and patriotic messaging, and for a time it feels indomitable. Prices lifting, accounts multiplying, confidence hardening into a kind of sovereignty people can hold in their palms. This is not a minor sideshow, it's psychological infrastructure for a rising middle class. Proof that modernity pays, that participation is rewarded, that the nation's ascent isn't only cranes and highways, but also personal balance sheets. In a decade shaped by leverage culture, the market becomes a new valve, another place where growth can be displayed, measured and consumed. Hegemony isn't just abroad, it's internal, in the expectation that the future will keep delivering. Then the behaviour changes. The ascent starts to wobble, not a clean drop at first, more like a slip on wet tile. Prices jerk, volatility thickens, the breath people have been holding turns shallow, the ticking clock becomes daily. What happens by closing bell shapes, what can be said in private by nightfall, and what can be admitted in public by morning. Historical ambiguity. Leverage amplified a downturn, intervention reshaped it, and the argument over which mattered more persists due to opaque data and selective disclosure. We come down from the skyline into a brokerage hall, fluorescent lit, air-conditioned, too cold for summer skin. The room smells of stale cigarette smoke clinging to jackets, and the faint sweetness of instant coffee spilled on carpet. Plastic chairs squeak, keyboards clatter. On a wall-mounted screen, red and green columns flicker fast enough to make the eyes ache. A middle-aged man rubs his thumb over a paper receipt until the ink smears. A younger woman grips a phone so tightly her knuckles pale. An old retiree wipes sweat from his temple with a crumpled tissue even though the air is chilled. The market here is not abstract, it is physical. It is stamped forms and ID checks, password slips and account printouts warm from the printer. It is the soft rasp of paper as someone flips a ledger, the sharp click of a mouse, the low murmur of crowded breath when a line turns red. Mechanism. Moment. Margin lending. Made concrete. An investor borrows money against their existing cash or securities, using it to buy more shares than they could afford outright. The broker records the loan. The account is marked with ratios, how much equity remains, how close the investor is to a margin call. When prices rise, leverage fattens gains. When prices fall, the account's cushion thins. If it thins too far, the broker can demand more cash or sell holdings to cover the loan, regardless of the investor's preference. It's blunt arithmetic enforced by contractual power, paper signed in calm weather, executed in a storm. The boom taught people to treat risk as normal. The first tremors teach them the cost of that lesson. Hard choice arrives with the smell of sweat and toner. Sell now and lock in losses, or hold and risk the forced sale that comes when the margin ratio collapses. Neither outcome feels clean. Selling feels like surrender. Holding can become a quagmire where the account bleeds until the broker's rules take control. Attrition isn't dramatic. It is cumulative. Sleepless eyes, a jaw clenched all day, a stomach that won't take food. People miss meals. People miss shifts. People sit beneath flickering screens until their backs ache, then stand in the humid night outside and breathe exhaust and fried oil, as if air itself might stabilize the chart. Outside the brokerage, life keeps its own schedule. A factory siren still calls the dawn shift. Buses still hiss to a stop. Doors folding open with a tired gasp. On street corners, vendors set out steamed buns, and the smell of yeast and oil cuts through the summer haze. The country's productive machine does not pause for volatility. But inside offices and apartments, the market's tremor begins to leak into everything. How people spend, how they speak, how they trust. The fracture line starts forming where it always forms, between what people were told, markets as modern reward, and what they begin to see, markets as political terrain, governed not only by supply and demand but by the state's willingness to let pain show. Now we cut tight to the object that makes the crash intimate. A cracked smartphone screen, spidered at one corner, reflecting a plunging red chart. The glass catches the room light and throws it back in jagged shards. The phone vibrates on a cheap wooden table, short, urgent pulses that rattle a metal cup of cold tea. A calloused finger swipes down, leaving a faint smear on the screen. Under the fingernail, dark grime from a machine shop shift that ended hours ago. The air in the room is warm and sour with sweat. A fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing hot air that smells of cooking oil soaked into curtains. Chart plunges, screen flickers. A notification arrives, numbers shrinking, ratios tightening, deadlines implied by the next opening bell. The phone keeps vibrating while the factory shift still starts at dawn. The investor's life is split between two clocks, the punch-in time and the market close. One is enforced by supervisors and wages, the other is enforced by leverage and decree. And as the red chart flickers in the cracked glass, the question sharpens into something heavy enough to carry into sleep. When the screen turns against you, who decides whether it is allowed to keep falling? The break comes fast enough to feel unreal. One day the screens glow with gain and certainty. The next, they stutter, red spreading across tickers like a rash, indexes dropping hard, the air in offices thickening with sweat and stale coffee. Heat presses against glass towers. Outside, the city smells of exhaust and fried oil. Inside, the blue light of monitors turns faces pale. A boom fed by leverage does what leveraged booms do when the slope turns. It slides, then it runs. And Beijing does not treat it as a normal market event. A crash in 2015 is not allowed to be merely financial. It threatens confidence. And confidence is not just sentiment here. It is a resource tied to legitimacy. When millions of retail investors are watching their savings evaporate in real time, the state hears the risk as social attrition. Anger spreading through families, workplaces, chat groups, dorm rooms. The ticking clock is daily. The closing bell isn't a number. It's a mood that can harden overnight. So the response arrives as blunt force applied to a marketplace. Emergency bans, state-backed buying, trading halts. Rules change mid-flight. Pain is not simply priced in, it is managed. Historical ambiguity. Leverage amplified a downturn, intervention reshaped it, and the argument over which mattered more persists due to opaque data and selective disclosure. We cut to the exchanges and the brokerages where the force becomes visible. A trading floor under harsh fluorescent lights. Air conditioning blows cold onto sweaty necks. The room smells of plastic chairs, stale cigarettes embedded in fabric, and instant noodles open too close to keyboards. Screens flicker. Numbers update too fast for calm. A printer chatters and spits out account statements that curl at the edges from heat. A woman grips her phone, thumb hovering over "sell," and the device vibrates against her palm like a pulse gone irregular. Somewhere behind her, a man coughs, dry and sharp, and keeps watching. Mechanism. Moment. The state intervenes by changing the operating rules of the market itself. Authorities restrict selling by major shareholders, suspend new listings, encourage or direct state-linked funds and institutions to buy, and allow or compel trading halts that freeze price discovery. In practice, this means a stock can stop trading entirely, no exit, no entry, while the rest of the market keeps falling. Liquidity becomes rationed by decree. The market is still open, but the doors inside it keep closing. The friction is immediate. Margin accounts begin to snap. Borrowed money demands collateral. Collateral is the same falling stock. As prices drop, brokers issue margin calls, requests for more cash, more securities, more anything to restore ratios. If the investor can't meet the call, holdings are sold automatically. But selling into a falling market accelerates the fall, and halts can block the sale, trapping both investor and broker in a tightening vice. The sound of this system is not dramatic, it's administrative. Alerts pinging, forms printed, risk teams on phones, compliance officers reading new circulars while the market ticks downward. Outside, the country's ordinary schedule keeps grinding. A factory shift still starts at dawn. In a dorm corridor, the smell of damp laundry mixes with cooking oil from a shared kitchen. Metal bunk frames creak. A man pulls on work gloves stiff with dried grime, and his phone buzzes again. Losses, warnings, the sense of money draining while he tightens bolts under fluorescent shop lights. Attrition shows up in red-rimmed eyes at the assembly line, in tempers that shorten, in meals skipped because nausea wins. We cut to a brokerage office after hours. The air is warmer, stale, thick with the metallic tang of overheated electronics. Desks are covered with paper, client lists, loan agreements, margin ratios circled in pen. A red chop lands on a form, thud, then lifts, leaving wet ink that glints before drying. The paperwork grows because the rules keep changing and everyone wants deniability. Signatures multiply. Responsibility is spread thin like cheap soup. The hard choice is everywhere and nowhere. Sell into a collapse and lock in the damage, or hold and risk being frozen, unable to sell, unable to breathe, waiting for decrees to decide whether you get an exit. Each option has teeth. Now we cut tight to the psychological rupture, the place where policy becomes intimate. A small apartment at night. The fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing warm air that smells of sweat and cooking oil soaked into curtains. On the table, a cracked smartphone, glass spidered at one corner, reflecting a plunging red chart. The screen flickers. A metal cup of cold tea rattles as the phone vibrates again. A calloused finger swipes down. Grime sits under the nail from a machine shop shift. The glow makes the room feel smaller, harsher, more exposed. Chart plunges. Screen flickers. A notification arrives. Trading halted. Another, margin ratio breached. Another, new restrictions announced. The sequence is not a conversation, it is a narrowing corridor. The investor cannot bargain with it. The market is no longer just a place where risk is priced. It is a place where permission is granted. Permission to sell, permission to hold, permission to feel safe. And that is the fracture line that lasts. A middle class told to trust markets learns, with the taste of cold tea and the buzz of a phone in the dark, that markets are political terrain, managed, constrained, and weaponized when stability is on the line. The closing bell approaches like a siren you can't hear but can feel. If the screen is allowed to fall again tomorrow, what else will be allowed to fall with it? After the intervention, the market is still standing, but it is not the same market. The summer heat remains. Concrete holds it and throws it back. In the evenings, the air smells of street oil and exhaust, and the glow from apartment blocks looks steady again. Windows lit, televisions murmuring, fans clicking as they push warm air through rooms that feel too small for the anxiety they contain. On the surface, the crisis has been met with action. Bans, buying, halts, new rules delivered at speed. The screens stop falling as freely, the immediate freefall is checked, but checking a fall is not the same as restoring trust. The geopolitical order does not tilt because of a stock index alone, yet inside China the psychological terrain shifts. A middle class told to believe in markets has learned that the marketplace can be bent by decree, and that confidence is a resource managed from above. The cost is not only financial, it is cognitive. It changes what people dare to assume about risk, fairness, and predictability. The ticking clock remains daily. Closing bell still decides whether the night is calm or clenched, but now there is another clock, slower and heavier. The state's evolving doctrine that financial risks are not merely technical problems. They are political threats to stability, and threats invite enforcement. Historical ambiguity, leverage amplified a downturn, intervention reshaped it, and the balance between the two remains contested because data is opaque and disclosures selective. We move into the aftermath where the machinery of control becomes routine, a brokerage hall weeks later. The fluorescent lights still buzz, the air still smells of plastic chairs and stale smoke trapped in fabric, but the mood is different, less frenzy, more caution. People speak lower, paperwork is thicker. A clerk stamps forms with that same blunt rhythm, thud, lift, red ink glinting wet before it dries. Account statements print and curl, risk disclosures are longer, compliance notices are posted on walls, corners curling in humid air. Mechanism moment. When the state treats confidence as rationed, the market's primary function, price discovery, becomes subordinate to stability management. Trading halts can freeze losses in place. Selling restrictions can prevent large holders from exiting. State-linked buying can create a floor that is as political as it is financial. The effect is blunt. Volatility is not eliminated but redirected. Liquidity is not a neutral property. It is permission. And when permission becomes the mechanism, participants adjust by seeking safety not only in fundamentals, but in alignment. What is allowed today? What will be punished tomorrow? The material consequences spread beyond brokerage halls. Households nurse losses quietly. The phone still vibrates at odd hours, but now it is news, not just prices, policy updates, warnings about rumours, reminders that the market is watched. In factories, shift whistles still call dawn, and the smell of machine oil still clings to hands and sleeves. But in break rooms, conversations shorten. In street markets, purchases become tighter. Confidence leaks away in small decisions. Not buying, not investing, not speaking. Attrition appears as fatigue. Eyes red from late nights staring at flickering charts. Tempers shortened by money stress. A sense of being trapped between two systems. The formal promise of markets and the informal reality that politics sits above the price. And in the elite, the lesson lands even harder. Financiers who once assumed they could manage risk through leverage and access now see the state willing to rewrite the game mid-flight. If the state can halt trading, it can halt other things. If it can mobilize buying to stabilize an index, it can mobilize investigations to stabilize a narrative. The crash becomes a rehearsal for a broader shift, the hunt for financial risks. Now we cut back to the object that made this rupture personal, and we watch it change meaning. A cracked smartphone screen on a kitchen table. The glass still spiderwebs at one corner reflecting a red chart that no longer plunges in clean freefall but jerks. Halted, resumed, restricted, nudged. The screen flickers. A fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing warm air that smells of sweat and cooking oil. A metal cup of cold tea sits beside the phone, a ring of condensation on the wood. The phone vibrates once, then again, then stops. A calloused thumb swipes down. Under the nail, grime from a shift that started at dawn and ended with overtime. The notification is not just a price move, it is a policy move, a warning, a reminder. Mechanism moment. The investor learns that market risk and political risk are not separate categories. When rules can change overnight, the risk is no longer only, will the company earn? It is also, will the state permit the trade? That realization alters behavior more than any percentage loss. It teaches caution that is not economic but social. What to buy, what to hold, what to say, what to avoid. Chart plunges, screen flickers, then steadies under constraints. The rupture primes what comes next. A state that has watched confidence evaporate on screens will treat volatility as a threat that must be contained. Containment invites surveillance. Surveillance invites enforcement. And enforcement needs targets. Names, networks, tycoons who symbolize risk in a way the public can recognize. The phone goes dark. The room stays warm. The fan keeps clicking. And somewhere beyond the apartment block's hum, the next net is already being pulled tighter. This time around the people who move money, not just the numbers that flicker on glass. Map zooms to Shenzhen line. From above, the geography looks clean. A coastline cut by bays, a river mouth opening into the South China Sea, and a thin boundary that changes everything. Hong Kong sits on deep harbour water, salt air, diesel, wet rope, and the city's skyline rises hard from rock and reclaimed land, glass and steel catching humidity until the light turns milky. To the north, Shenzhen presses close, a mainland metropolis built at speed, its highways and rail lines aimed straight at the border like arteries. This is why Hong Kong is useful. Not because it is romantic, because it is engineered for contracts, a legal system built to adjudicate paper disputes with predictable procedure, courts that can enforce, banks that can hold dollar accounts, a currency that can move across the world without waiting for domestic approvals. And a press that, for much of this era, can still publish what the mainland will not. The air in Hong Kong carries sea salt and engine exhaust. In summer it is thick and wet, and in winter it has a sharp edge that makes the lungs feel too small. For mainland magnates, this city becomes a financial antechamber, a place where money can change shape, not vanish, not become clean, just become different, routed through offshore vehicles parked in foreign currency, structured through corporate layers that do not immediately attract Beijing's gaze. For groups like Tomorrow, whose webs thrive on paper and intermediaries, Hong Kong is a tool with a specific function: distance. But two systems is not a magic charm. It is a timetable and a negotiation, written into law and contested in practice. The border is not merely a line on a map. It is jurisdiction made physical. Whose police, whose courts, whose sovereignty decides the fate of a person once he steps outside the mainland? That is the fracture line that will matter most when pressure rises. The hard choice for tycoons is stark: stay visible and compliant, or shelter assets where politics has less oxygen. We descend into the city at street level, Central District at midday. The air smells of sea salt, perfume and exhaust trapped between towers. Trams rattle, a metallic squeal on rails. In lobbies, marble floors reflect ceiling lights. Air conditioning blows cold, dry air that raises gooseflesh on forearms still damp from humidity outside. Bank counters gleam. Security guards watch faces with professional blankness. Paper moves in neat stacks, account forms, incorporation documents, certified copies sealed in plastic sleeves. Across the harbour, ferries churn the water into grey foam. Their engines thrum low, and the wake smells like diesel and algae. Up on the hills, apartment blocks hold heat, and laundry dries slowly in the wet air. Down in back streets, small offices run corporate plumbing. Brass nameplates, glass doors, printers chattering late, the smell of toner and stale tea. Mechanism moment. How Hong Kong lets money change shape. A mainland business can establish an offshore holding company, often in jurisdictions like the British Virgin Islands or Cayman Islands, then use Hong Kong as the operational hub. Directors' meetings on paper, bank accounts in foreign currency, investment proceeds booked through entities that look ordinary within international finance. Contracts are written under Hong Kong law, disputes routed through courts that can enforce judgments with procedure rather than political discretion. The power is not mystical, it is administrative predictability, a signature recognized, a lien enforceable, an account transferable. For a tycoon, this can mean raising funds abroad, holding assets in dollars, and structuring ownership in layers that are harder to map from Beijing's desks in real time. This predictability becomes a kind of shelter, not total, not permanent, but useful. It creates space, space to move funds, space to restructure, space to wait out a storm on the mainland. Then we cut to the border, where the shelter's price becomes visible, a checkpoint hall under fluorescent light, bright, cold, humming. The air smells of disinfectant and damp wool from jackets held close, shoes scuff tile. A line forms between metal railings, passports open and close with a soft crackle, a plastic tray slides forward. A uniformed officer's hand moves with practiced economy, stamp, lift, ink blooming on paper. The sound is small but final. Hong Kong is close enough to be reached quickly from Shenzhen by road or rail. That closeness is the point. A magnate can be in a mainland meeting in the morning and in a Hong Kong bank lobby by afternoon, the taste of airport coffee still bitter on the tongue. The border can be crossed fast, until it cannot. Because two systems is a negotiation, and negotiations have pressure points. The fracture line is jurisdiction. A contract is only as strong as the court that enforces it. A safe house is only safe if the door stays under your control. Historical ambiguity. The exact degree to which specific mainland magnates relied on Hong Kong structures at particular moments can be difficult to trace due to layered entities, intermediaries, and partial disclosure. Now we go tight on the motif that makes the chapter real. A border checkpoint stamp, ink still wet under fluorescent light. The page is slightly rough, fibres catching the edge of a fingertip. The ink is glossy, smelling sharp, chemical and faintly metallic. A thumb hovers near the mark, careful not to smear it. The stamp is not decorative. It is a switch. Inside or outside, one jurisdiction or another, one set of police powers or another. The difference is sovereignty rendered into a rectangle of red. The hard choice sits in that wet ink. Stay visible and compliant inside the mainland's tightening net, or shelter assets across the line where courts and contracts have more predictable weight. One choice risks political exposure, the other risks becoming a target the moment the shield is judged intolerable. The stamp dries, the passport closes, the fluorescent hum continues, and somewhere beyond the checkpoint money is already changing shape again, quietly, efficiently, while the question grows heavier. When the shield fails, who will be caught standing on the wrong side of the line? Hong Kong's usefulness is a function of distance measured in minutes. A car can leave Shenzhen on wet asphalt, wipers beating time, and reach the boundary before the radio finishes news cycle. A train can cross the line with commuters packed shoulder to shoulder, breath warm in air-conditioned chill. The closeness makes the city valuable, near enough to be reached fast, far enough, legally, financially, institutionally, to feel like another climate. But two systems is not a wall of stone. It is a timetable and a negotiation. The boundary is jurisdiction given a physical body, checkpoints, uniformed officers, databases, stamps. And after 2012, as Beijing tightens discipline and treats financial risk as a political threat, that jurisdiction question becomes sharper. Who decides the fate of a person once he steps outside the mainland? Whose police can act? Whose courts can compel? Whose sovereignty gets the final word? For tycoons, Hong Kong has functioned as a shield because it lets money change shape without immediately attracting Beijing's gaze. Yet the shield's strength depends on political tolerance, and tolerance is never infinite. The ticking clock here is not seasonal. It is strategic. Every year brings a new adjustment to what is considered acceptable autonomy and what is considered unacceptable escape. We drop into the city's financial plumbing where the shield is manufactured. A private bank lobby in Central. Marble floors cold underfoot. Air conditioning dry enough to raise gooseflesh on skin still damp from humidity outside. The smell is polished wood, perfume, and printer toner. A receptionist's smile is procedural. A security guard's gaze is steady. In glass-walled rooms, meetings happen quickly, shorter than they used to be on the mainland, and quieter. Pens scratch paper. A stapler snaps shut. A sealed folder slides across a table, the cardboard edges worn from handling. Mechanism moment. How offshore vehicles and Hong Kong accounts create separation. An offshore company is established, often registered in a jurisdiction designed for corporate vehicles. Then a Hong Kong bank account is opened in that company's name. Ownership is layered through subsidiaries and nominees. Funds can be booked as investments, loans, dividends, management fees. The practical advantage is not magic secrecy. It is compartmentalization. Different entities hold different assets, and the paperwork is organized under legal procedures that are predictable. Contracts can be written under Hong Kong law, disputes routed through courts that enforce through process. Money and foreign currency can be held and transferred without waiting for mainland approvals. For groups like Tomorrow, whose web is built from layered entities and stakes, that compartmentalization has obvious value. It can reduce immediate visibility. It can delay scrutiny. It can keep options open when rules on the mainland change mid-flight. But the friction is not in the paperwork. The friction is political. We cut to a newsroom, desks cluttered with coffee cups and rolled-up sleeves. The air smells of stale caffeine and warm electronics. Screens glow. Editors watch wording. A headline is adjusted, softened. A phone call comes in and the room quiets. Hong Kong's press can publish more than the mainland will, but the freedom is not absolute. It is contested, pressured, negotiated. The shield's public layer, information, has its own choke points. Now we cut back to the border, a checkpoint hall under fluorescent lights so bright it flattens faces. The air smells of disinfectant and damp wool. Shoes scuff tile. A line forms between metal railings. A man shifts his weight. The leather of a briefcase creaks as he adjusts his grip. On the wall, signage is clean and bilingual. Passport opens. A plastic tray slides forward. The officer's stamp lands with a dull thud, then lifts. Fresh red ink glints wet. Here is the hard choice, made daily. Remain visible and compliant inside the mainland's tightening enforcement state, or shelter assets and sometimes oneself across the line where courts and contracts are more stable. The choice is stark because both outcomes are bad in different ways. Staying inside reduces suspicion, but increases vulnerability to political turns. Sheltering outside reduces immediate control, but increases the risk of being labelled evasive, of becoming an example. Attrition follows, quiet but real. Travel becomes cautious, meetings are shorter, intermediaries multiply, more paperwork is produced, not because the deal is more complex, but because the risk calculus has changed. Deniability becomes a material artifact, additional sign-offs, extra layers of corporate ownership, more stamped copies stored in more places. The smell of ink solvent becomes a constant companion. Historical ambiguity. The exact operational details of how specific mainland networks used Hong Kong structures at particular moments remains difficult to verify due to layered intermediaries and incomplete public records. Now we cut to the point where the shield feels thin enough to tear. A hotel room in Hong Kong late at night. Curtains drawn. Air conditioning humming. Cold air drying sweat on the back of a neck. The room smells of carpet shampoo and faint cigarette residue embedded in fabric. On a desk sits a folder of documents, share certificates, bank letters, incorporation papers, edges scuffed, corners softened. A phone vibrates once, then stops. The screen lights the room in blue. On the bed, a passport lies open. The border stamp from earlier is still fresh enough that the red ink has a slight sheen under the lamp. A thumb hovers near it, careful not to smear. The mark is proof of having crossed. It is also proof of where the body is and which jurisdiction now claims it. Mechanism. Moment. Jurisdiction is enforced through control of movement and cooperation between authorities. The shield holds when legal boundaries are respected and political tolerance remains. It weakens when cooperation increases, when requests for assistance, detentions, or extradition-like mechanisms become more assertive, and when the border becomes less of a barrier and more of a filter. The passport closes with a soft clap. The ink continues to dry. And the question that hangs in the room's cold air is no longer theoretical. If Hong Kong has been used as a safe house, what happens when the safe house begins to share keys? The safe house does not fail all at once. It weakens. Hong Kong's skyline still rises hard from rock and reclaimed land. glass catching humidity until the light turns milky. Ferries still churn a diesel-scented water into grey foam. In Central, marble lobbies stay cold, polished, efficient. Yet the political atmosphere tightens around the same structures that once felt like insulation: contract law, foreign currency accounts, offshore vehicles, a press that could still publish what the mainland would not. Two systems remains on paper, but it is also a timetable and a negotiation, and negotiations change when the stronger party decides the pace. For mainland magnates, the fallout is not simply financial, it is existential. Hong Kong's value has always been jurisdictional distance, space between a person and the mainland's enforcement reach. As Beijing's posture hardens after 2012, discipline, anti-graft, financial risk hunting, that space begins to feel less like a wall and more like a corridor with cameras. The ticking clock is not just personal, it is systemic. Every time a tycoon uses Hong Kong to shelter assets, the state is reminded that capital can run. Every time capital runs, the state's impulse to seal exits grows stronger. Sovereignty does not tolerate the impression of escape. We return to the border, where this becomes physical. A checkpoint hall under fluorescent light, bright, cold, humming. The air smells of disinfectant and damp wool. Metal railings guide the line into narrow lanes. Shoes scuff tile. Passports open and close with soft crackles. A uniformed officer's stamp lands, thud, then lifts, leaving fresh red ink that glints wet before it dries. Mechanism. Moment. The border is not only a crossing, it is a filter. Movement is recorded, permissions granted or withheld, and the practical strength of jurisdiction depends on whether authorities coordinate across the line. When cooperation increases through mutual assistance requests, shared intelligence, pressure on intermediaries, the protective gap narrows without needing to redraw the border itself. The line can remain on the map while becoming more permeable to enforcement. This is the new reality for business. The old methods still function, but each use carries more risk. Offshore vehicles can still be formed, dollar accounts can still be opened, contracts can still be written under Hong Kong law. Yet the very act of layering and moving begins to look, from Beijing's point of view, like intent. Daily commerce responds in the only way it knows: more paper, more deniability, more compartmentalization. In small offices behind glass doors, printers chatter late. The smell of toner and stale tea hangs in the air. Certified copies are made and sealed. Corporate records are boxed and labelled. A clerk's fingertips are ink-stained. A folder is passed hand to hand with careful restraint, as if touching it too openly could leave residue. In boardrooms, meetings shorten further. Banquets become rare and muted. Less alcohol, fewer photographs, fewer visible alignments. People sit with straighter backs, shoulders tight, eyes scanning exits and screens. A phone vibrates once and is silenced. A whispered introduction is still valuable, but it is now dangerous in a way it wasn't before. Patronage has already been reclassified from stabilizer to liability. Now shelter is drifting toward the same category. Hard choice becomes stark enough to feel like a vice. Stay visible and compliant on the mainland and accept the net, or shelter assets in Hong Kong and accept that the shield is thinning, and that thinning itself could be read as guilt. Either option extracts a price. Staying visible limits your room to maneuver. Sheltering creates suspicion that can travel faster than any legal process. Historical ambiguity. The precise moment when specific actors concluded Hong Kong could no longer function as reliable insulation varies and is hard to date definitively due to secrecy and retrospective framing. Now we cut to the final, intimate symbol of jurisdiction. Wet ink becoming irreversible. A border checkpoint stamp under fluorescent light. The ink is still wet, glossy, smelling sharp and chemical with a faint metallic edge. The paper beneath is slightly rough, fibres catching a fingertip. A thumb hovers near the mark, careful not to smear. The stamp is small, the power behind it is not. In a nearby hotel corridor, carpet muffles footsteps. The air smells of disinfectant and stale smoke embedded in fabric. A door closes with a soft click. Inside, a briefcase opens. A folder of share certificates and account letters sits on a desk, edges worn, corners softened. A phone screen lights the room in blue and then goes dark. The fan of the air conditioner hums steadily, drying sweat and drying ink. The stamp dries. jurisdiction settles onto the page like a verdict. Hong Kong has been used as a shield because money could change shape here, quietly, efficiently, without immediately drawing Beijing's gaze. But a shield is only as strong as the sovereignty that tolerates it. When tolerance tightens, the shield doesn't shatter theatrically. It becomes unreliable. It becomes porous. It becomes a place where the same paperwork that once offered distance now creates a trail. And that is how the next chapter begins, not with a chase, but with extraction. Quiet, administrative, relentless. Because when the state decides the safe house has become an exit route, it does not argue with the law. It redefines what the law is allowed to mean. January 2017. Hong Kong's harbour is a black sheet under winter cloud, cut by ferry wakes that smell of diesel and salt. The wind comes off the water with a wet edge, sliding between towers and along the expressways that run like concrete veins toward the border. Deep harbour, hard rock, dense glass. This city was built to move capital without hesitation, to enforce contracts with procedure, to keep money legible in ledgers and courts. But the region's autonomy is not a permanent shield. It is conditional, it is negotiated, it is timed. And by 2017, the mainland's enforcement state is no longer content to wait at the edge of the line. After years of discipline campaigns and financial risk hunting, the question that matters is jurisdiction. The blunt question beneath every offshore structure and every dollar account. Whose police? Whose courts? Whose sovereignty decides when the state wants a body more than it wants a contract? The air in Central tastes faintly of exhaust and sea spray. In lobbies, air conditioning dries the skin. In back offices, printers chatter late. Paper stacks squared and stapled. Ink stamps landing with dull thuds. The city still functions as an antechamber for mainland wealth. Foreign currency accounts, offshore vehicles, corporate layers thick enough to slow attention. But the thickness is administrative, not indomitable. If the mainland decides a person is movable, the paper becomes thin. The stakes are elite and social at once. If a magnate can be taken here, then no sanctuary is assumed. Not by bankers, not by lawyers, not by anyone who believed distance could be purchased. Now we are inside the Four Seasons. The corridor smells of disinfectant and damp wool, coats hung too close to heated air, a faint sourness trapped in carpet. Fluorescent lights hum with a cold, flat tone. Doors line the hallway like sealed mouths. A service cart squeaks as it rolls, metal wheels whispering over carpet pile. Somewhere an ice machine clicks and exhales. It is early, too early for the city's public face, but not too early for the people who keep money alive. In nearby rooms and nearby towers, risk committees convene before sunrise. Phones ring and go unanswered. A lawyer's laptop screen glows blue in the dark, reflected in a window that shows nothing but smeared city lights. A banker's tie is knotted tight, then loosened, then tightened again, hands dry from sanitizer, fingertips smudged with toner from printed statements. Locked doors become data points. Silence becomes signal. Hong Kong's power is normally procedural. Contracts, courts, custody rules, borders with checks and records. But coercive capacity works differently. It does not argue with paper, it overrides it. When the mainland security state decides someone is movable, the usual sequence, warrants, hearings, filings, can be bypassed through force, secrecy, and speed. Passports and keycards become props. The decisive instrument is control of movement. Elevators, exits, vehicles, the border itself. Reports converge on the same material image. Xiao Jianhua vanishes from Hong Kong in the early hours in late January 2017. Widely reported as being led out of the Four Seasons in a wheelchair with his head covered, then taken into mainland custody. Around that disappearance, everything becomes procedural in the worst way. Compliance teams pull files, counterparties call and get voicemail. A bank drafts internal memos with cautious verbs: review, monitor, assess. While the real calculation is raw. What is exposure? What is reputational blast radius? What can freeze without collapsing? Paper slides across desks. Drawers lock with dull clicks. In a conference room, cold coffee sits in a glass, bitter and metallic on the tongue. The ticking clock is rumour. Each hour without an official account becomes a tremor. Market signal, political signal, warning shot aimed beyond one man. Hard choice: speak and invite scrutiny, or stay silent and accept the new order. Move assets and look evasive, or keep them in place and look compliant. In Hong Kong, the old assumption was that legality bought time. Now time is being purchased by something else, by obedience, by distance, by not being visible when the net tightens. Historical ambiguity. The exact route and the specific agents involved remain uncertain due to sealed records, anonymous sourcing, and sustained state silence, even as credible reporting converges on removal into mainland custody. Grainy lobby CCTV, marble floor under bright lights, polished enough to mirror movement in faint, warped reflections. A wheelchair crosses the frame. Rubber wheels roll without sound. A cluster of figures moves around it. Shapes, coats, the rigid geometry of escort. The image is flat, low resolution, clinical. That is its power. Up close, the details bite. The sterile lobby air, the faint scent of disinfectant that follows from corridor to elevator, the soft scuff of a shoe sole on marble, a keycard held between two fingers, a watch face catching light. A head covered, reported that way, turning a human being into a movable package. In that frame, contracts are nowhere, courts are nowhere. Two systems is nowhere. There is only capacity, the ability to lift, to wheel, to remove. And somewhere, as the CCTV loops, a phone vibrates again. Another call missed, another committee convened, another hour of rumour compounding into certainty. Before dawn, Hong Kong runs on low volume. Street sweepers hiss water across pavement. Ferries sit dark against the harbour, diesel and salt hanging in the damp air. The skyline is still there, glass, steel, money made visible. But the city's true strength is usually quieter. Procedure, contracts, courts, predictable enforcement. Then January 2017 tears a hole in that predictability. Xiao Jianhua vanishes from the Four Seasons, and within hours the disappearance is no longer a private problem. It becomes a jurisdictional flare. Reports describe him being removed in the early hours, led out in a wheelchair with his head covered, and taken into mainland custody. The geopolitical meaning is immediate. If a high-profile financier can be taken from Hong Kong, then Two Systems is not a shield you can rely on in a crisis. The episode fuels jitters about legal autonomy, the very autonomy that underpins the city's role as an antechamber for mainland capital. The ticking clock is rumour. Every hour without an official account is its own kind of force, market tremor, political signal, warning aimed at a wider elite that has been living off distance. We cut back inside the Four Seasons where the air is clinical and ordinary at the same time. Corridors smell of disinfectant and damp wool, carpet muffles footsteps, fluorescent lights hum with a flat, cold tone. Door latches click, an elevator arrives with a soft bell and exhales conditioned air that dries sweat on the back of a neck. Somewhere a service cart squeaks, metal wheels whispering over carpet pile. No drama is required. The setting is already tight enough to bruise. The grainy lobby footage becomes the city's shared reference point. A wheelchair crossing polished marble, figures clustered around it, movement that looks procedural until you remember what it implies. Hong Kong police review CCTV from the hotel and a border checkpoint, and later conclude he left voluntarily, even as the case initially registers as a kidnapping complaint connected to him. The word voluntary lands like a bureaucratic stone, heavy, blunt, hard to reconcile with the image of a covered head and an escorted chair. Reporting describes a statement published under his name denying abduction, a detail that only thickens uncertainty rather than clearing it. This is how coercive capacity defeats a paper-based city. Contracts and passports rely on process. Courts, filings, custody rules, clear chains of authority. Coercion relies on control of movement and control of information. If agents can move a person quickly, hotel to vehicle to checkpoint, then the legal questions arrive late, after the body is already outside the jurisdiction that would normally demand answers. The border stamp becomes an administrative afterimage, not a safeguard. And while reporters chase the outline of what happened, the financial system does what it always does when a key node disappears. It convenes procedure. Risk committees meet early. Phones ring and go unanswered. Locked doors become data. A compliance officer opens a file drawer and the metal rails rasp. The air smells of toner and cold tea gone bitter in a glass. Account statements print and curl at the edges. A red chop lands on paper, Thud, leaving wet ink that glints before it dries. Attrition spreads through the market in slow, ugly ways. Investors begin unloading shares linked to Xiao and tomorrow. Prices wobble. Counterparties re-evaluate exposure to a web of interconnected holdings and complex transactions. The cost is not just mark-to-market loss. It's the sudden awareness that corporate structure, subsidiaries, nominees, offshore layers, can't protect a principal from being physically removed. And once the principal is removed, the structure can become a quagmire of reputational and regulatory risk. Hard choice sharpens for everyone nearby. Treat the incident as an anomaly and keep doing business as usual, or assume the sanctuary has failed and start pulling back. Cancel meetings, delay deals, reduce visibility. Either path extracts a price. Pulling back can freeze liquidity and invite scrutiny. Continuing can look like defiance or blindness. Historical ambiguity. Credible reporting converges on removal into mainland custody, but the exact route and the specific agents involved remain uncertain due to sealed records, anonymous sourcing, and sustained state silence. Now we cut tight to the human-scale consequence, where the city's procedural skin meets raw power. A banker in a cramped office before sunrise, tie half done, cuffs damp from hand-washing, fingertips smudged with ink and printer dust, stares at a checklist of exposures. A lawyer's inbox fills with terse requests for documentation. The laptop fan whines. The room smells of stale coffee and overheated electronics. A phone vibrates once on a lacquered table, then again, rattling a metal cup. Outside, the first buses hiss to a stop, doors folding open with a tired gasp, because the city's labour still starts on schedule even as its sanctuary story collapses. In the cracked reflection of a lobby camera still frame, marble, wheelchair, escort, the lesson is indelible. Jurisdiction is not an abstract debate. It is whose hands can move a body when the state decides patience is wasted. And as rumour keeps ticking forward, hour by hour, the wider elite absorbs the signal Beijing is sending through silence. Distance will not save you, procedure will not shield you, and compliance is about to be redefined. After the removal, Hong Kong keeps moving, because cities always do. Ferries still cut the harbour, wake smelling of diesel and salt. Trams still rattle through canyons of glass. In Central, marble lobbies stay cold under air conditioning that dries the skin, and the air outside stays wet, clinging to shirts, carrying exhaust between towers. But the city's role changes in a single night. What had been treated as separation, procedure here, coercion there, collapses into a new reality. The Four Seasons incident doesn't only alter one man's fate. It ruptures an assumption that had stabilised the financial antechamber, that contracts and courts could buy time, that jurisdiction could slow the hand of sovereignty. Once a high-profile figure is widely reported as removable from this space into mainland custody, the safe house becomes conditional in a way that can't be ignored. The ticking clock is rumour. Each hour without an official account becomes a market tremor and a political signal. Silence is not empty, it is pressure. It spreads through chat groups, through boardrooms, through compliance lines that light up before dawn. By nightfall, what people dare to say is shaped by what they fear will be punished tomorrow morning. We cut to the immediate procedural fallout, because that is where modern power shows its teeth. A bank's risk committee room before sunrise. Fluorescent lights buzz. The air smells of toner, stale coffee and damp wool steaming off coats hung on chairbacks. Screens glow with exposure maps and counterparty lists. Printers chatter and spit out pages that curl at the edges. A red stamp lands on an internal memo, thud, ink glossy for a moment before it begins to dry. Doors that were open yesterday become locked today. Calls that were answered yesterday go to voicemail today. Lawyers and bankers do not need a confession to change behaviour. They need only uncertainty at the top of a chain. A principal disappears, and the chain becomes a quagmire. Ownership disputes, signature authority, credit lines, guarantees that no longer feel theoretical. The market's first response to coercive uncertainty is containment. Banks re-evaluate exposures, tighten collateral demands, shorten maturities and reprice risk where they can. Counterparties trigger clauses, pause disbursements, and demand documentation that can survive regulatory scrutiny. The change is not poetic, it is mechanical. Credit committees move from growth to defence, And defense has its own attrition. Projects slowed, deals abandoned, liquidity held back because nobody wants to be the hand that releases it. Outside, the city's workers still start the day. Buses hiss to a stop, doors folding open with a tired gasp. In a kitchen behind a noodle stall, boiling water throws steam that smells of starch and oil. A delivery rider's gloves are worn thin at the fingertips, hands chapped, knuckles split. The street doesn't pause for elite signals, yet the elite signals still land, because they decide whether payroll's clear and whether contractors get paid on time. In the Four Seasons corridor itself, the sensory residue lingers. Disinfectant sharp in the nose, carpet holding dampness, fluorescent hum flattening the air. The hotel becomes a reference point, an address that now carries a lesson about jurisdiction. The consequence isn't only fear, it is recalibration. The business class trims visibility, meetings shorten further, paperwork thickens, more layers, more signatures, more distance built into every step. Historical ambiguity. Credible reporting converges on removal into mainland custody, while the exact route and the specific agents involved remain uncertain due to sealed records, anonymous sourcing, and sustained state silence. The system absorbs the lesson quickly because the system is trained to. After 2012, discipline taught officials to fear the knock. After 2015, the market learned that rules can change mid-flight. In 2017, the elite learns that jurisdiction can be crossed without their consent. The pattern is calcified now. When stability is threatened, procedure yields to capacity. We return to the grainy lobby CCTV. Marble floor reflecting light in warped streaks, a wheelchair crossing the frame, figures clustered around it, movement that looks clinical because the image is clinical. No sound, no argument, just motion. A monitor in a back office replays the clip. The screen flickers slightly. The room smells of warm electronics and cold tea gone metallic in a glass. A hand pauses on the mouse. Fingertips show faint ink stains from paperwork handled too long. The clip loops again. Wheel, escort, exit. Each loop drains another layer of denial. When official information is withheld, rumour becomes the only circulating currency, and rumour can be punished, redirected, starved. Institutions respond by rationing speech internally, fewer emails, more in-person meetings, fewer names written down. The enforcement state doesn't need to publish a full account to win. It needs the wider elite to internalise the risk and self-censor before the next example is chosen. The cracked edge of the CCTV image catches glare. The marble reflection shimmers. The disinfectant smell seems sharper in memory than it ever was in the corridor. And in that sterile loop is the betrayal of assumed sanctuary, proof that passports and contracts can become thin paper when the security state decides a person is movable. The lobby camera keeps watching. The clip keeps looping, and the next clampdown isn't on money first, it's on the oxygen that moves money at all. Information, tightened until even rumour learns to hold its breath. The second operation doesn't wear uniforms, it wears paperwork and silence. Hong Kong can still smell like diesel and salt on the harbour wind, but the shockwave runs north through fibre optic lines. In mainland cities, winter air sits heavy with coal grit, and apartment blocks glow with phone light, blue rectangles in tired hands, screens that refresh compulsively. A name that had been spoken in boardrooms and whispered in corridors becomes unstable on the internet. You type it, you search, you get results, then you don't. After Xiao Jianhua's disappearance, searches and links related to him, and tomorrow holdings begin vanishing, with results turning up older material while newer posts and reports disappear. This is not only about one billionaire, it is about sovereignty over narrative. If the state has moved a person, it must also move the story, because stories create factions, factions create questions, and questions create a quagmire that can't be controlled with handcuffs alone. So the response becomes administrative, content removed, keywords throttled, pages that refuse to resolve. The fracture line is epistemic. In Hong Kong, whispers fill the gap. On the mainland, silence becomes enforced consensus. The ticking clock is hours. How fast can content be removed before it metastasizes into a narrative Beijing cannot steer? We step into the machinery that makes erasure feel ordinary. A newsroom desk at midnight, stale coffee, warm electronics, the faint chemical bite of printer toner. A keyboard clacks in short bursts, a mouse clicks. A headline draft sits on screen, then is revised into something blander, thinner, deniable. A phone vibrates against wood, rattling a metal cup. Editors don't need a courtroom to understand risk. They need only the memory of careers ended by the wrong paragraph. Administrative control over speech works through directives and platform compliance. Orders can arrive through propaganda and regulatory channels, and platforms, WeChat, Weibo, app publishers, carry the burden of execution, deleting posts, disabling search results, blocking links, throttling keywords. Archives that track censored WeChat posts record dozens of articles containing Xiao Jianhua being removed after the disappearance, and similar deletions for Ming Tiangxi, the Chinese name used for Tomorrow Group. On the mainland, the result is tactile, even though it's digital. Links break, posts grey out. A chat thread loses its anchors, messages still there, but the referenced article now a blank pane. The phone's glass warms under a thumb. The back of the device smells faintly of plastic heated by constant use. Refresh. Nothing. Refresh again. The silence becomes a texture. Reports circulate of direct deletion instructions aimed at media and platforms, language-telling websites to find and delete news relating to Xiao Jianhua or Tomorrow Group. In a platform moderation office, the work is dull and relentless. Fluorescent lights hum. Air conditioning dries the skin. A supervisor points to a list of terms. A junior staffer copies and pastes URLs into an internal tool. A queue drains as fast as fingers can move. The sound is repetitive. Mouse click, keyboard tap, the soft thud of a stamp in a different office, approving a different kind of removal. This is attrition by bureaucracy. Death by 1,000 administrative cuts. Hard choice everywhere. Delete quickly and prove obedience, or hesitate and risk becoming the next example. For editors and platform staff, the danger is not only legal, it is career-ending, social, calcified into caution. For bankers watching from glass offices, the calculation is colder. If a name can be erased on command, then the market's information layer is not a neutral instrument, it is political terrain. Historical ambiguity. The full scope of deletion across platforms is contested, because censorship leaves partial traces, and enforcement can be uneven. Cursor clicks, page blanks. A phone in a palm, screen cracked at the edge from an old drop onto tile. The display shows a WeChat headline loading, spinning circle, white background, the faint glow reflecting in a tired eye. The room smells of instant noodles and cooking oil soaked into curtains. A fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing warm air across a desk scattered with receipts and a smudged bank statement. The headline flashes into view for a heartbeat, then vanishes. The page turns blank. The app returns to the chat list as if nothing happened. The material reality is digital, but it lands in the body. A thumb pauses. The phone vibrates once with an incoming message, then goes still. Somewhere outside, a bus sighs to a stop. Doors fold open with a tired gasp. A night shift worker walks past steaming street food and exhaust, the air damp against the face. Life continues, information does not. And the lesson spreads faster than any official announcement. If a billionaire can become a search term that stops resolving, then silence is not absence, it is policy. The blackout is not a technical glitch. It is a signal aimed at the wider elite. Do not ask, do not share, do not build stories the state cannot control. On the mainland, the blackout moves faster than weather. 1 hour, the name circulates, typed into search bars, pasted into group chats, spoken in clipped tones over steamed buns and bus exhaust. The next hour, the same name begins to decay into silence. Search results thin out. Links that worked at lunch return errors by dinner. The internet, usually noisy with commerce and complaint, develops a clean blankness around a single cluster of words. After Xiao Jianhua's disappearance, posts and reports tied to him begin disappearing, and searches begin surfacing older material while newer items vanish. That pattern is not random. It is administrative power applied to speech, sovereignty expressed through deletion queues and keyword controls. The fracture line is epistemic. In Hong Kong, the harbour wind still smells of diesel and salt, and whispers move through lobbies and boardrooms like damp cold through carpet. On the mainland, silence becomes enforced consensus, and the consensus is not persuasion. It is subtraction, removing the story before it hardens into a narrative Beijing cannot steer. The ticking clock is hours. Every hour that passes without an official account is another hour rumour can metastasize. Every hour that passes with content still online is another hour the state looks slow. So the machine moves with indomitable speed, trading transparency for control, trading knowledge for obedience. We cut to the room where the blackout is made. No uniforms, just screens. A platform moderation floor under fluorescent lights. The air conditioning dries the skin. The room smells of warm plastic, stale instant coffee and toner dust. Rows of monitors glow blue. A supervisor hands down a list, keywords, names, variants, printed on cheap paper that curls at the corners. A junior staffer's mouse clicks in steady rhythm. A queue counter drops. URLs are pasted into an internal tool. Posts vanish. A search suggestion disappears. A comment thread turns grey. Censorship at scale works like a supply chain. Directives move from authorities to platforms and editors. Platforms translate the directive into executable rules. Keyword blocks, link removals, account warnings, search suppression, then teams enforce it through dashboards and escalation ladders. The action is blunt. Delete the post, break the link, throttle the term, freeze the account. Archives that track censored WeChat posts record dozens of censored articles containing Xiao Jianhua, with similar deletions for Ming Tiangxi, a reference to Tomorrow Group. Now the editor's desk, a newsroom at night, stale with cigarette residue embedded in coats and the sour edge of cold tea in a glass. The keyboard clacks in short bursts. A headline draft is softened into something thinner, safer, deniable. An email arrives. No signature, no flourish, just instruction. Delete. The discipline is learned, not debated. Editors know which stories end careers, and that knowledge is calcified into reflex. Outside, the city keeps its own schedule. A late bus sighs to a stop, doors folding open with a tired gasp. A street vendor lifts a lid off a metal pot. Steam smells of starch and oil. In a cramped apartment, a fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing warm air across a table scattered with receipts and a smudged bank statement. The material reality of the blackout is digital, but the consequence is physical. Thumbs tapping refresh, eyes drying out under phone light, shoulders tightening as anchors disappear. Attrition follows the deletion wave. Trust erodes in small bites. Investors cannot confirm rumours. Bankers cannot cite sources. Lawyers cannot rely on a link that might go dead before a meeting ends. Risk committees convene early, not because they have facts, but because they lack them. Phones ring and go unanswered. A file drawer closes with a dull metallic click. Uncertainty becomes a cost centre. Hard choice arrives for everyone who handles information. Share what you saw and risk being flagged, or stay silent and accept enforced ignorance. Screenshot and become a conduit, or refuse and become complicit. On the mainland, silence is safer than accuracy. In Hong Kong, whispers fill the gap, and that gap grows wider by the hour. Historical ambiguity. The full scope and uniformity of deletion across platforms remains contested because censorship leaves partial traces and enforcement is uneven. Cursor clicks, page blanks. A WeChat headline loads on a cracked smartphone screen. Glass spidered at the edge from an old drop onto tile. The screen flickers. A spinning circle turns once, twice. For a heartbeat the text appears, black characters on white. Then it vanishes, replaced by a blank page. The phone vibrates against the tabletop, rattling a metal cup of cold tea. The air in the room smells of instant noodles and cooking oil soaked into curtains. A thumb hovers, taps back, taps forward, refreshes. Nothing resolves. This is the enforcement state's cleanest weapon, not the arrest, but the erasure that follows. A billionaire becomes a search term that stops resolving, and the silence lands as a political signal aimed at the wider elite. Distance won't protect you, and information won't protect you either. The blackout moves faster than rumour can settle, and that speed becomes its own kind of threat. After the blackout order, the air changes, not the weather, the atmosphere of knowing. Hong Kong still has harbour wind that smells of diesel and salt. On the mainland, winter smog still tastes of coal grit and cold metal. But the information layer, the thing modern finance breathes, tightens until it feels thin. The disappearance is one operation. The erasure is the next. Together they form a template. Move the body, then move the story. Posts and reports tied to Xiao Jianhua and Tomorrow Holdings begin disappearing after his removal, and reports circulate of leaked instructions directing platforms to delete items related to Xiao and Tomorrow. The most responsible reading is not that the internet becomes empty, but that it becomes uneven. Deletion instructions are reported while application varies across platforms and time, leaving partial traces and holes that deepen distrust. Historical ambiguity. The full scope of the deletion order across platforms remains contested because censorship leaves partial traces and enforcement can be uneven. This is the fallout, an epistemic split hard enough to crack a shared reality. In Hong Kong, whispers fill the gap. In the mainland, silence becomes enforced consensus. The state does not need to persuade when it can subtract, and subtraction does more than hide one story. It trains behaviour. It teaches bankers, lawyers, editors and investors that knowledge can be treated as contraband. The ticking clock remains measured in hours, not because the public is impatient, but because the state is. The faster a story is erased, the harder it is for it to become an uncontrollable narrative. Time is not just news cycle pressure, it is a tool of sovereignty. We move into the new normal, institutions operating inside managed ignorance. A compliance meeting before sunrise. Fluorescent lights buzz. Air conditioning dries skin. The room smells of toner and stale coffee. Papers are stacked and squared, corners curled. Someone reads an internal memo that avoids names, avoids specifics, uses sterile verbs, monitor, review, mitigate. A red stamp lands on the document. Thud. Wet ink glinting for a moment before it dries to matte. The room is quiet enough to hear a chair leg scrape. Information control changes how enforcement works because enforcement depends on narrative. When public accounting is denied, no transparent charges, no open reporting, no stable record, the state's actions become harder to contest and easier to reshape. Platforms and editors do the labour of absence, making it difficult for counterparties to cite sources, for investors to verify, for institutions to coordinate outside approved channels. That pushes decision-making inward, into closed rooms where fear and alignment matter more than evidence. A system that once relied on public disclosure for market discipline now relies on private signals and political inference. On the mainland, the blackout produces a peculiar kind of attrition. Not the sudden blast of panic, but the slow draining of trust. A banker can't forward a link because it will die. A lawyer can't cite a report because it may already be gone. A risk officer builds a model on partial data, then has to defend it to superiors who are also operating in the dark. The cost shows up as hesitation, credit tightened, approvals delayed. Counterparties treated as toxic because their story cannot be safely spoken aloud. In Hong Kong, the gap fills with rumour. In a marble lobby, air cold and dry, a pair of men speak in low tones beside a column. The smell is polished stone and perfume, but underneath it is something older, caution. Their voices drop when others pass. Phones are kept face down. Screens reflect ceiling lights like tiny moons. The legal system is still built for contracts, but contracts are only as useful as the political tolerance surrounding them. When the state has demonstrated the ability to reach through jurisdiction and then erase the record, safe house becomes a phrase people stop using out loud. The hard choice for elites shifts again. It's no longer only where to put money, it's what to admit you know. Speak and risk being flagged. Stay silent and accept the consensus. You can shelter assets, but you cannot shelter a narrative if the platforms are trained to delete it. This sets the conditions for what comes next, the dismantling of tomorrow without public accounting. Once the public record is thinned, the process can proceed with less friction. Actions can be framed as risk management rather than factional cleanup. Failures can be blamed without being examined. Responsibility can be assigned without being debated. Cursor clicks, page blanks. A WeChat headline loads on a phone in a cramped apartment. The glass is warm under the thumb. The room smells of instant noodles and cooking oil soaked into curtains. A fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing warm air over a table with receipts and a smudged bank statement. The headline appears, black characters on white, then vanishes. The page turns blank. The app returns to the chat list as if the story never existed. A thumb taps back, then forward. Refresh. Nothing resolves. The blankness is not empty. It is engineered. The blank page is a behavioral signal. It teaches people to stop trying, to stop sharing, to stop anchoring conversations to public sources. When enough people learn that lesson, silence becomes consensus without needing to be argued for. The state doesn't have to win the debate. It can prevent the debate from forming. The phone vibrates once with a new message. No link, just a vague warning. Be careful. The words are thin, but their weight is heavy. The room's air feels warmer now, stale with breath and anxiety. Outside, a bus sighs to a stop, doors folding open with a tired gasp. Because life keeps its schedule even when information is brought to heel. And that is the bridge forward. When the Blackout Order succeeds, dismantling can proceed quietly. Assets unwound, networks severed, institutions restructured, without a public narrative to resist it. The story of tomorrow will not be told in open court or open press. It will be told in disappearing pages, in sealed files, and in the silence that follows a name that no longer resolves. After the body is moved and the story is thinned, the machinery can be opened. Beijing does not need to explain everything to act. It needs only enough control to prevent panic, enough silence to keep rumours from hardening into runs. Winter air still carries coal grit, and the city's smog can turn dusk into a bruised grey wash. In that air, regulators turn from the spectacle of disappearance to the work that matters, the balance sheets, the guarantees, the interlocking stakes, tomorrow's maze. The problem is contagion. Tomorrow touched banks and insurers, financing deals through layered entities, and off-balance sheet promises that look stable until liquidity tightens. Now liquidity is the clock again, refinancing cycles that do not care about politics, obligations that mature on schedule, paper that must be rolled or paid. If a single matured obligation goes unpaid in public, it risks a chain reaction. Counterparties demand cash, depositors grow anxious, institutions freeze. So the state chooses controlled demolition, not an uncontrolled collapse that would stain legitimacy. A managed dismantling designed to keep the blast contained. Audits, takeovers, asset transfers, liabilities ring-fenced inside restructured entities. The hard choice is political economy, and it is brutal. Disclose the damage and risk panic, or absorb it quietly and let certainty replace truth. We come down into the institutions where this demolition is carried out. A bank headquarters lobby on a wet morning. Rain streaks down glass, blurring the street beyond into smeared headlights and umbrellas. The air inside smells of polished stone and damp coats. Security gates stand in a row, metal teeth waiting. Employees file in with plastic badges. The beep of scanners is routine until it isn't. When regulators decide an institution is at risk of contagion, they can isolate exposures by pushing assets and liabilities into new structures, subsidiaries, special vehicles, restructured entities, designed to keep losses from spreading through the wider system. Bad assets can be separated from functioning operations. Guarantees can be unwound or reassigned. Ownership stakes can be transferred to state-linked holders who can stabilize governance. The work is done through audits and takeovers. Teams arrive with authority, demand books, duplicate servers, freeze certain transactions, and rewrite who controls what. It is demolition with scaffolding, breaking the dangerous parts while trying to keep the building upright. Inside an office floor, fluorescent lights buzz. The air is dry with air conditioning and smells of toner and cold tea. A printer chatters, spitting out account lists that curl at the edges. Legal teams sit with thick binders, paper clipped and tabbed, corners softened by handling. A red chop lands on an internal memo, thud, ink glossy for a moment before it dries. For staff, the material reality is procedural, and it hits fast. A badge fails at the turnstile. The scanner flashes red. The beep becomes a denial. A security guard steps closer, polite but firm. Upstairs, an IT team copies servers, hard drives humming, fans whining, while compliance officers pack paper files into sealed boxes. Cardboard scrapes across carpet. Tape peels with a dry rasp. A supervisor locks a cabinet and pockets the key. Phones ring and go unanswered because nobody wants to promise anything they cannot deliver. Attrition shows itself in small motions, hands trembling slightly as they sign inventory sheets, eyes red from late nights, shoulders tight under damp wool coats. In conference rooms, risk committees convene before sunrise. Because the refinancing clock does not stop. Maturities keep arriving. If they cannot be rolled quietly, they must be paid quietly. If neither is possible, the story threatens to return in public. Outside, rain keeps falling. Water runs down the glass lobby door in thin streams carrying grime. The city's traffic hisses on wet asphalt. The smell of damp concrete rises from the street. Hard choice, again and again, move fast and keep it quiet, or move slow and risk the market hearing the crack. The precise sequencing and full internal scope of specific audits, transfers and takeovers can be difficult to reconstruct in real time due to sealed proceedings, limited disclosure, and intentional opacity. Now the camera tightens to the symbol the public is allowed to see. A seizure notice taped to a glass lobby door, edges curling in rain. The paper is thin, already softening where moisture creeps in. The tape has trapped tiny bubbles, making the notice look bruised under the light. Letters are printed cleanly, but the glass behind them is streaked with water, and the outside world is blurred. Rain streaks down glass. A hand presses the notice flat from inside, fingertips leaving faint smears on damp paper. The sound is soft, almost nothing. But it is an announcement without explanation. The state is here, the state is acting, and you will learn only what the state permits you to know. The paper curls again as the rain continues. The refinancing clock keeps ticking behind the door, and the demolition has only begun. The demolition is timed to the refinancing calendar. Obligations mature on fixed dates. Short borrowings, guarantees, funding promises that were built to be rolled again and again while growth outran doubt. Now the seams are being opened under supervision. Beijing's priority is not confession, it is containment. Winter air still tastes of coal grit after rain. Inside the system, the work is fluorescent and dry, the smell of toner and cold tea hanging in closed rooms. Controlled demolition means breaking load-bearing links without letting the building collapse in public. Audits, takeovers, asset transfers, done in sequence, fast enough that panic cannot get a clean runway. If panic outruns the paperwork, it becomes a run. And runs spread faster than any directive. The clock is daily. Whether the next maturity is paid, rolled, or quietly transformed into something longer. The hard choice is political economy. Disclose the damage and risk a stampede, or absorb it in silence and let certainty replace truth. Each option has teeth. Disclosure invites fear. Silence invites rumour. Rumour, once it bites, becomes its own contagion. We cut to a working room, fluorescent lights buzzing, air sharp with printer heat, rubber stamp pads left open, smelling faintly chemical. A wall calendar is scarred with red circles, maturity dates, committee meetings, reporting deadlines. Paper stacks sit squared on the table, corners curled, tabs frayed. A chop lands, thud, wet ink glinting before it dries. Ring fencing is done by drawing new boundaries around risk. Exposures linked to tomorrow are identified and isolated. Assets shifted into restructured entities, liabilities boxed where they can be managed and monitored. Ownership stakes can be transferred to new custodians. Guarantees can be unwound or reassigned. Intercompany channels can be frozen so losses do not leak across institutions. The work is ledger deep. Auditors tracing signatures, compliance teams matching payments to entities, entities to guarantors, guarantors to collateral, trying to keep contagion from hopping the fence. Now the camera moves to a bank lobby on a wet morning. Rain streaks down the glass. Umbrellas drip onto stone tiles, leaving dark puddles that smell of damp wool and street grime. The security gates blink green, then red. A badge scanner beeps once, denial, and the routine becomes a check. Upstairs, the friction turns procedural. File cabinets open with a gritty scrape. Paper files, softened at the corners from years of handling, are inventoried and sealed in cardboard boxes. Tape peels with a dry rasp. Server fans whine as drives are copied. Metal casings warm under steady load. Phones ring and go unanswered. Risk committees convene before sunrise. Faces pale under screen light. Collars damp from rushed commutes. The air is stale, recycled, edged with bitter coffee. Attrition follows in slow steps. Approvals are delayed because nobody wants to be the signature. Transfers are double-checked, then checked again. Contractors wait beside unfinished sites, boots stuck in wet gravel, rebar bleeding orange where rainwater pools, cement dust turns to paste on pant legs. If financing pauses, wages pause. If wages pause, the social clock starts ticking louder. The internal sequencing and exact allocation of losses remain hard to map from outside because disclosure is limited and many proceedings are sealed. We tighten to a single desk. A spreadsheet printout lies under a desk lamp, paper rough under the fingertip. Red pen circles today's maturity and tomorrow's. A stapled packet of amended terms sits beside it, still smelling of hot toner. A hand signs an authorization line, pen scratching, leaving a faint indent. Nearby, a plastic badge clip is cracked, replaced, reissued, revalidated, access granted and revoked in bursts as control changes hands. The mechanism is blunt at this scale: pay, roll, or restructure before the market notices. A missed obligation is not just a default, it is a signal. Signals travel through chat histories and trading screens, through the sudden silence of a phone that stops being answered. Rain taps the window. In the lobby below, a notice curls further at the edges as moisture creeps in. A sealed box is lifted, carried away, and the tape squeals softly as it tightens. The refinancing clock advances toward the next date, and the demolition has to stay ahead of it, because if it falls behind, the story returns in public with teeth. When the demolition stays controlled, the public sees calm. Rain washes the streets. Traffic hisses on wet asphalt. In financial districts, glass towers keep their lights on, and the city's daily rhythm continues. Buses arriving, doors folding open with a tired gasp, workers stepping out into damp air that smells of exhaust and wet concrete. The system, from the outside, looks steady enough to trust. That steadiness is the objective. Inside, the steadiness is manufactured. Tomorrow's web, stakes, guarantees, layered entities, does not disappear like smoke. It is dismantled like machinery. Pieces removed, replaced, boxed, reassigned. The state's priority is not the satisfaction of public truth, it is the prevention of contagion. Stability is treated as a higher good than transparency, because transparency can spark fear, and fear can move money faster than any regulator can chase it. The hard choice is the one the state chooses again and again. Absorb the damage quietly and let certainty replace truth. If you disclose too much, you invite panic. If you disclose too little, you invite rumour. The state accepts rumour as the cheaper poison, because rumour can be starved. The ticking clock remains refinancing. Every matured obligation is a potential headline. Every headline is a potential run. So the work continues in silence until the balance sheet stops bleeding in ways that can be publicly seen. We return to the institutions after the first wave of takeovers and audits has passed. An office floor where the air is dry and stale, smelling of toner and old carpet. Fluorescent lights buzz without mercy. The desks look the same, but the access doesn't. Badges have been reissued. Some doors open, others stay locked. Servers hum behind glass, fans whining steadily. A compliance team sits with inventories, lists of accounts, lists of guarantees, lists of counterparties, printed and reprinted until the paper edges curl. Controlled demolition works by transforming uncertainty into administrable compartments. Losses are ring-fenced, exposures consolidated into entities that can be monitored, governance replaced with custodianship that can enforce discipline. Assets are transferred to stabilize key institutions, liabilities are restructured so maturities are pushed forward, spreads are contained, and the immediate liquidity cliff is softened. Where a market would demand a clean price and a public reckoning, the state prefers a managed timeline. Time bought through restructuring and enforced calm. This is not only finance, it is narrative management. If the public record is thin, if the earlier blackout has already trained people to accept blank pages, then dismantling can proceed without a stable counterstory. A seizure notice can appear without an explanation. A restructuring can happen without a public accounting of who bears the loss. The state can write the sequence in the order it needs, not the order transparency would demand. For staff, the fallout is tactile and humiliating in small ways. A badge fails one day, works the next. A desk is cleared without warning. A sealed box replaces a file drawer. Cardboard scraping across carpet. Tape pulled tight with a dry squeal. The smell of damp wool lingers in meeting rooms where jackets never fully dry. Phones ring and go unanswered. People learn to speak in sterile verbs and short phrases, because precision can be dangerous when the story is being controlled. Attrition shows up in the gaps. Postponed projects, delayed credit, counterparties treated as suspect. Outside, a contractor stands under a site awning, rain dripping from the edge, boots sunk in wet gravel. Rebar rusts where water pools. The smell is metallic and damp. Payroll waits on a transfer that waits on approval. Approval waits on a committee that meets behind closed doors. The full distribution of losses and the internal deliberations behind specific asset transfers remain difficult to establish publicly due to limited disclosure and sealed processes. Rain streaks down glass. We return to the seizure notice taped to a lobby door, edges curling as moisture creeps in. The paper is softened now, fibres swelling, tape bubbles trapping tiny pockets of air. The letters remain clean, but the glass behind them is streaked, blurring the world outside into smeared lights and umbrellas. A hand presses the notice flat again, fingertips leaving faint smudges on damp paper. The gesture is small, almost instinctive, trying to make something look orderly in a process designed to be orderly above all else. The final instrument is substitution, certainty in place of truth. When the state absorbs damage quietly, it offers a different product to the public: continuity. Banks open, ATMs function, salaries arrive, the visible world stays intact. In exchange, the public is asked to accept an incomplete record, a narrative written from above, a sequence without full disclosure. It is an economic bargain enforced by administrative power. The notice curls back as soon as the hand withdraws. Rain keeps streaking down the glass, the city keeps moving, and that is the bridge forward into the next chapter. Once stability is prioritized over transparency, the final version of events must be fixed somewhere the public can see, not through open reporting, but through a trial where the state writes the record in its own order, on its own terms, and calls that version the truth. July 2022. The summer air over Shanghai sits heavy, thick with humidity that makes shirts cling and turns concrete into a heat sponge. Traffic grinds along wide roads, engines low, horns impatient, the city's glass towers catching sun in dull flashes. 5 years after the Four Seasons Corridor and the Blackout Order, the case surfaces again, through procedure, not visibility. Canada's embassy said officials were blocked from attending Xiao Jianhua's trial. The detail matters because it tells you what kind of event this is: adjudication without witnesses, a legal act shaped by sovereignty. The state must demonstrate control over financial risk and over private capital, but it must do it without pulling elite relationships into open light, without letting the evidentiary spine become public material that factions can weaponize or markets can panic over. Then, in August 2022, a Shanghai court sentences Xiao to 13 years in prison and fines. Tomorrow Holdings 55.03 billion yuan, described as record scale by Chinese standards. The numbers land like ballast. They are heavy enough to signal deterrence, heavy enough to say, the state can reach, the state can punish, the state can close the file. The ticking clock here is reputational. Beijing has to prove it can contain contagion and impose discipline, without exposing too much of what made tomorrow possible in the first place. Every detail withheld is a shield against elite fracture. Every detail announced is a warning to anyone else still running leverage on borrowed trust. Historical ambiguity. The political purpose of the timing and the chosen level of publicity is debated. Closed proceedings and limited documentation make deeper factional dynamics unprovable. We drop to street level at the courthouse, a facade of pale stone and glass, metal barriers, police presence without spectacle. The air smells of hot asphalt, car exhaust and rain residue baked into sidewalks. People pass without stopping because stopping invites attention. A security camera lens stares from above a doorway unblinking. The building feels less like a forum and more like a container. Material reality becomes stark. An official statement, a list of charges, and then silence. The Shanghai First Intermediate Court names charges including illegally siphoning away public deposits, betraying the use of entrusted property, illegal use of funds, and bribery. The phrasing is formal, but the message is blunt. Finance crimes are being framed as threats to state financial security, not merely private wrongdoing. Adjudication under party-state conditions. The court announces verdict and penalty. The public sees the shell of legality, names of crimes, length of sentence, size of fine, while the evidentiary spine remains mostly out of sight. When foreign officials are blocked from attending and proceedings remain closed or minimally documented, the case functions less as public adjudication and more as controlled signalling. It demonstrates sovereignty over the financial class while restricting what outsiders, markets, and rival networks can verify. You can feel how this discipline works in small physical details. The scrape of a barrier foot on pavement, the sterile smell of disinfectant near an entrance, the click of a security gate, the flat thud of a stamp on paper inside an office that never opens its curtains. Somewhere nearby, a clerk's fingers are ink-stained. Pages curl at the corners from heat. A printer spits out statements that warm your palm for a second before cooling into evidence. The hard choice behind the scene is political economy, the same calculus that guided the controlled demolition. Disclose and risk panic, or absorb quietly and let certainty replace truth. Here, the state chooses certainty, verdict first, witnesses absent, record thin. Now the camera tightens to the door. A courtroom door in a corridor lit by harsh fluorescence. The air is dry and cool, smelling faintly of cleaning chemicals and damp wool carried in on jackets. The hallway is empty enough that you can hear your own shoes, rubber soles squeaking once then falling quiet. Echoing footsteps fade out. The door closes with a final padded sound. A latch settles. The public is left with what it is permitted to hold: a sentence, a fine, and a statement that does not show the marrow. Tomorrow Holdings is fined 5503 billion yuan, an amount so large it functions like a warning sign bolted to the gate. Xiao receives 13 years, and the system proves it can convert a vanished man into a formal conclusion on the record, without opening the full case file to the world. This is sovereignty asserting itself over private capital in the cleanest way it can manage, punishment without illumination. And once that method is normalized, the next chapter can widen the target list, because other billionaires don't need to see the evidence to learn the lesson. They only need to hear the door close. China, at the turn of the decade, is a country running on bandwidth and balance sheets. High-rises sweat in summer heat. Expressways shimmer. Data centers hum behind unmarked doors, fans pulling hot air through metal grates that smell faintly of dust and ozone. On the coast, ports still taste of diesel and salt. Inland, concrete holds warmth late into the night, and the air carries the sour edge of exhaust trapped between towers. This is the terrain where private platforms begin to look like quasi-states, moving credit, steering consumption, holding user data at national scale. And that scale creates a problem of sovereignty. The party can tolerate wealth. It can even tolerate spectacle. What it will not tolerate is any private actor dictating the terms of risk. So the state leans into a mechanism it has always possessed, now sharpened for the digital era: governance by license. In November 2020, regulators suspended Ant Group's planned listing, reported as about $37 billion, just days before trading was due to begin in Shanghai and Hong Kong. The move followed a meeting between Jack Ma and regulators, and later reporting said Ma's prior public criticism of the regulatory system angered senior officials. The message isn't delivered with sirens, it's delivered with a freeze. A countdown stopped, a door that doesn't open. In a world built on momentum, stopping is its own kind of coercion. Then, July 2021. The Cyberspace Administration of China ordered app stores to stop offering Didi's app, citing illegal collection of users' personal data 4 days after the company's New York listing. An icon disappears from download pages, and a platform that seemed indomitable is forced to kneel to an administrative notice. The stakes are not only corporate, they are civilizational in the bluntest sense. Who controls credit? Who controls data? Who controls the tempo of modernization? The hard choice for Beijing is permanent: risk open market volatility, or enforce hegemony and accept slower innovation. The ticking clock is legitimacy, measured in stability. One tremor too many, one panic too loud, and the system bleeds confidence in public. Historical ambiguity. Whether these crackdowns were centrally orchestrated or agency-driven remains contested due to opaque decision chains and self-interested leaks. Outcomes matched declared priorities, attribution stays uncertain. Now we move from the skyline into the rooms where licenses become levers. A compliance floor at midnight, fluorescent lights buzz, air conditioning dries the throat. The room smells of toner and stale coffee turning metallic at the bottom of paper cups. Screens glow blue, spreadsheets scroll, printers chatter and spit out pages that curl at the corners. A red chop lands on a document. Thud. Ink glossy for a breath before it dries to matte. Product teams are displaced by compliance teams, not metaphorically, physically. Desks reassigned, meeting rooms booked for rectification. Lanyards and visitor badges stacked in plastic bins. A security guard's radio crackles softly in a hallway that used to host launch celebrations. Governance by license is the power to revoke permissions that markets assume are earned. The right to lend is treated like a valve. Turn it, and a platform's revenue model starves. The right to list is treated like a gate. Close it, and valuation becomes vapor. The right to collect and move data is treated as perimeter control. Breach it, and distribution can be cut off by order. The instrument is administrative speed. Circulars, notices, meetings that produce obligations overnight, enforced by regulators and platform compliance departments before the next trading day opens. The marketplace learns, again, that rulebooks can change mid-flight. We cut to a glass-walled conference room. The air smells faintly of sanitizer and damp wool from jackets hung too close to vents. A founder's chair sits empty. Cameras are avoided. Statements are drafted in careful verbs. Cooperate, improve, comply. Language as tight as a knotted tie. Expansion plans stall under regulatory attrition. Projects paused. Partnerships reconsidered. Overseas ambition trimmed back to what can survive scrutiny. Outside, ordinary life presses on. A street vendor lifts a lid off a metal pot. Steam smells of starch and oil, mixing with traffic exhaust. A delivery rider's gloves are worn thin at the fingertips, hands chapped, knuckles cracked. Phones vibrate in pockets with market alerts while factory shifts still start at dawn. The bite of the modern economy is that it doesn't pause for policy until policy pauses it. We tighten to the motif, where sovereignty becomes visible in a single glance. A smartphone on a scratched wooden table. The screen has a hairline crack that catches light like a thin scar. On one side, a frozen IPO countdown, numbers stopped mid-second, an expectant clock that refuses to move. On the other, a greyed-out app icon, dimmed as if drained of oxygen, sitting beside text that says the download is unavailable. The phone's glass is warm under the thumb. The room smells of instant noodles and old cooking oil soaked into curtains. A fan clicks as it oscillates, pushing hot air across scattered receipts and a smudged bank statement. This is what governance by license looks like when it touches the hand. A freeze, a removal, a permission revoked at administrative speed. And as the countdown stays frozen and the icon stays grey, the question hardens. When the state can stop lending, stop listing, and stop distribution on command, what happens to private capital's claim that it is the engine, and not merely a tenant of China's future?